Some stories do not begin with violence. They start with silence, with a moment so ordinary that it was almost nothing to worry about, until you realize what that silence really means. Tonight, we will watch 3 true stories where reality slowly unravels in ways that are almost inexplicable. Each story begins in a familiar world and then gradually drifts away from it, step by step, until what remains feels completely unrecognizable. And in each case, there are films and recordings that have truly turned these events into things that people will never forget. Our first story begins in Ukraine with a little girl named Oksana Malaya. She was born on November 4th, 1983. Her early life was not an easy one. Her parents were extremely poor, and they both struggled with severe alcoholism. Their home was a place of neglect, not a place of warmth and safety. And in the winter of 1986, this neglect would change Oksana's life forever. She was only 3 years old at the time. One freezing night, her parents, lost in a drunken haze, completely forgot about their daughter. They left her outside in the bitter cold of a Ukrainian winter and locked the door. A 3-year-old child, alone in the freezing darkness, has very few options. All she knew was that she was cold, and she needed to find warmth to survive. Instinct took over. She crawled towards the only source of warmth she could find, which was the family's dog kennel in the yard. Inside, a number of dogs were huddled together, sleeping. Incredibly, as this tiny human child crawled into their space, the dogs didn't attack her or chase her away. Instead, they seemed to accept her. They let her snuggle in with them, sharing their body heat, and in that moment, they saved her life. But this act of kindness from the dogs would set Oksana on a path that no one could have ever predicted. The next morning, Oksana didn't go back into the house. And her parents, still consumed by their addiction, didn't seem to notice that she was gone. One day turned into 2, and 2 days turned into a week. A week turned into a month, and then a year. For the next 5 years, Oksana Malaya lived in that kennel with her family of dogs. From the critical developmental ages of 3 to 8, she had almost no contact with other human beings. Her entire world was the pack. She learned from them. She mirrored them. It was a matter of survival. Slowly, she stopped walking on 2 legs. It was easier and more natural to move on all 4s, just like her canine family. She forgot the few human words she knew and began to communicate through barks, growls, and whimpers. She ate what they ate, which was often raw meat and scraps. Her human identity faded away, replaced by the identity of a dog. In her own mind, that's what she was. She was a member of the pack. This went on until the early 1990s. One day, a person walking near the property saw something that made them stop in their tracks. They saw a small figure running around in the woods behind the house, on all 4s, barking. They couldn't believe their eyes. Confused and concerned, they called the police. When the officers arrived, Oksana's dog family immediately sprang into action. They ran out, surrounding her, barking aggressively at the strange men, protecting one of their own. And Oksana, terrified, started barking ferociously right alongside them. She didn't want these humans to take her. Eventually, the police had to use pieces of meat to lure the other dogs away. Only then were they able to get close enough to retrieve the frightened little girl. When Oksana was taken into custody, the doctors who examined her were stunned. She had physically forgotten how to walk like a human. She couldn't speak a single word. They were deeply concerned. The years from 3 to 8 are absolutely crucial for language development. They feared that because she had missed that window, she might never be able to learn to speak at all. Oksana was placed in an orphanage where a long and difficult journey began. She had to relearn the most basic human behaviors. Slowly, painstakingly, she learned how to stand and walk on 2 legs again. And amazingly, against all odds, she did learn how to speak. But even with these incredible achievements, the 5 years she spent as a dog had left a permanent mark. Although she could form words and sentences, her speech was always flat and monotone. There was no rhythm, no intonation, no emotion in her voice. It made her very difficult to understand and connect with. A psychologist assessed her and concluded that despite being a young adult by this time, Oksana's mental capacity was only that of a 6-year-old. She tried her best to reintegrate into society. By the time she was 22, she even had a boyfriend. He didn't know much about her unique and traumatic past. One day, she decided to show him a part of who she was. She showed him how easily she could still run around and bark just like a dog. It was a part of her history. But the sight apparently terrified him. He broke up with her shortly after and never saw her again. Today, Oksana lives on a farm where she takes care of animals. It's a quiet life, and perhaps it's where she feels most comfortable. She was recently interviewed on a Ukrainian talk show, and she said she no longer wants to live or act like a dog. She said, more than anything, she just wants to be a normal person. Now we move to our second story, which takes us to England in 2008. This case involves identical twin sisters, Ursula and Sabina Eriksson. The two were 41 years old and originally from Sweden. After being apart for many years, they had finally reunited on May 15, 2008. Within just 24 hours of seeing each other again, they decided to take a trip together. They boarded a ferry and headed for Liverpool, England. They arrived in Liverpool at 8:30 in the morning on Saturday, May 17th. Their very first stop was not a hotel or a tourist attraction, but the St. Anne's police station. Once inside, Sabina told the officers that she was extremely concerned for the safety of her children who were back home in Ireland. The police took her seriously. They told her they would follow up, and they did. They contacted the police department in Dublin, who sent officers to Sabina's home. They checked on the children and found that everything was perfectly fine. There was no danger at all. So, with that seemingly resolved, Ursula and Sabina left the police station on foot. They made their way to a bus stop, and at around 11:30 in the morning, they boarded a bus that was headed for London. As the bus started its journey, the driver noticed the sisters were still holding on to all of their luggage. He politely asked them to put their bags in the luggage hold underneath the bus, which was standard procedure. But the women aggressively refused. They started clutching their bags tightly to their chests as if they were protecting something precious. Their behavior made the driver incredibly uncomfortable. He didn't know what was in their bags, and their intense reaction was a major red flag. He decided he didn't want them on his bus. He pulled over at the next service station just outside the city and told the two sisters they had to get off. After they got off the bus, the driver called the police. He told them there was something very strange going on with these two women and that they might want to come and check them out. As it happened, a police officer was already at that service station. He walked over to the sisters and started talking to them. After a brief conversation, the officer decided they weren't a threat to anyone. He figured it was all just a misunderstanding, so he let them go. The officer left, and the bus was long gone. So Ursula and Sabina, now stranded at a service station, started walking. But they didn't walk along the local roads. They started walking down the median of the M6, one of the busiest motorways in the country. A short time later, a highway security camera captured what happened next. The footage shows the two women walking down the central reservation with cars and trucks speeding past them on both sides. At one point, they try to run across the active lanes of traffic. It's clear from the video that it's an impossible and incredibly dangerous thing to do. And sure enough, Sabina gets hit by a car. Thankfully, she was only grazed by the vehicle, so she wasn't seriously injured. She and her sister went back to the median. But several motorists had seen what happened and had called the police. By sheer coincidence, the patrol car that responded to the call was being followed by a film crew They were shooting for a British television show called Traffic Cops. So when the police arrived on the scene, the cameras were rolling, capturing every moment. The officers managed to get the sisters off the median and over to the relative safety of the shoulder. They started talking to them, trying to understand what was going on. On camera, everything seems to de-escalate. The women appear calm. It looks like they were just two people who were stranded and making some very poor decisions. Then, without any warning, everything changed. Ursula suddenly turned away from the officers and made a dead sprint back into traffic. Cars were whizzing by at high speed. One of the officers lunged and managed to grab the sleeve of her jacket, but she wriggled out of it. She launched herself directly into the path of a massive truck that was traveling at nearly 60 miles an hour. The impact was horrific, and she was thrown down the road. Everyone stood there in shock. And then, just a second later, Sabina started screaming. She yelled, "They're going to steal your organs!" And then she too leaped into traffic. She was immediately hit by another car. The police ran into the road, stopping all traffic. They rushed over to Ursula, the first sister who was hit. They could see that her legs were completely shattered, but somehow she was still alive. As for Sabina, she was unconscious. They didn't know if she was going to make it. When the paramedics arrived, things got even stranger. Ursula, despite her catastrophic injuries, started fighting to sit up. The paramedics were trying to keep her still, telling her that her legs were broken and she was lucky to be alive. But she wouldn't listen. She fought them violently, spitting at the paramedics and the police, and screaming obscenities as if they were the ones trying to hurt her. At the same time, Sabina regained consciousness. The police and paramedics were trying to keep her lying on the ground, but she began fighting her way up. She pushed the officers off of her, managed to get to her feet, and squared off with one of the female police officers. Then she punched the officer directly in the face before turning and running down the motorway. Several officers had to chase after her. They finally surrounded her as she stood with her fists up, ready to fight them all. They had to tackle her to the ground and put her in handcuffs just to stop her from hurting herself or anyone else. Both sisters were taken to the hospital. And as soon as they got there, they both appeared to be acting completely normal again, as if nothing had happened. Ursula was admitted due to her broken legs. She remained calm and cooperative throughout her recovery and was eventually released. No charges were ever pressed against her. Sabina was checked out by doctors, and miraculously, she had no serious injuries. She was released from the hospital and taken to the police station, where she was charged for assaulting the police officer. The very next day, Sabina pleaded guilty to the charges. She was sentenced to just 1 day in custody, which she had already served while waiting for her court appearance. So, she was released. She walked out of the police station a free woman. Later that night, she was walking down a street when she saw two men walking towards her. Their names were Glenn Hollinshead and his friend Peter. She stopped them and asked if they knew of any good bed and breakfasts nearby. Glenn told her that, as a matter of fact, he owned one and she was welcome to stay at his place. Initially, Sabina seemed hesitant, maybe like she thought it was a trap. But she eventually agreed, and the three of them went back to Glenn's house. Once they were inside, Glenn and Peter noticed that Sabina was acting very paranoid. She was constantly looking out of all the windows as if she was expecting someone to come for her. At one point, she offered both men a cigarette. They accepted, but just as she was about to light them, she suddenly snatched the cigarettes out of their mouths. She said, "These might be poisoned," and threw them in the trash. Just before midnight, Peter left, and Glenn and Sabina went to their separate rooms to sleep. The next day, Glenn got up to make some tea and food for Sabina. He realized he was out of tea bags, so he stepped outside and called over to his neighbor, Frank. He asked if he could borrow a few. Frank gave him the tea bags, and Glenn went back inside. About a minute later, Frank saw Glenn stagger back out of his house. He was clutching his stomach and screaming, "She stabbed me!" Frank said his neighbor's last words were, "Frank, take care of my dog," and then he collapsed and died. Frank immediately called the police. Sabina fled from the house and started running. She made her way to a nearby highway and was seen running along the side of the road. A motorist named Josh saw her and he noticed she was holding a hammer. As she ran, she was repeatedly hitting herself in the head with it. Josh drove past her, pulled over, and got out of his car to try to intercept her. But as she ran towards him, she pulled a roof tile out of her pocket and threw it, hitting Josh in the head. She ran right past him and made it to a bridge that overlooked another road below. Without hesitating, she leaped off. It was a 40-foot drop. When she hit the ground, she broke both of her ankles and fractured her skull. But again, she survived. Police and paramedics were called, and Sabina was taken back to the hospital. And just like before, once she was there, she was reportedly acting totally normal again. Sabina was arrested for the murder of Glenn Hollinshead. She pleaded guilty to manslaughter, but she offered absolutely no explanation for why any of it happened. It was as if she was a completely different person from the one who had committed these violent acts. Her defense team argued that she was suffering from a rare psychiatric condition known as folie à deux, which is a French term that means madness of two. It's a shared psychosis that can sometimes present in identical twins, where one twin has a psychotic break and they somehow transmit their delusion or their insanity to the other twin. The defense claimed Ursula had the initial break and Sabina was caught in the echo of her madness. Amazingly, the prosecution accepted this claim. Sabina was sentenced to only 5 years in prison. She served her sentence, was released in 2011, and to this day, she is a free woman. Our final story tonight is about a young woman named Lauren Giddings. In June of 2011, Lauren was a law student on the verge of achieving her dream. She was just one final exam away from graduating and becoming a public defender. She was smart, dedicated, and well-liked by everyone who knew her. Despite the intense pressure of her upcoming exam, she had taken the first week of June off to go to her sister's wedding, where she was the maid of honor. Right before she left the wedding to head back to school, she joked with her family. She told them she was going to be locking herself in the library, studying 24/7, and that they shouldn't bother trying to get in touch with her. When she got back to her apartment complex near campus, however, things didn't go as planned. Her classmates, the ones she usually studied with, didn't see her at the library. In fact, no one saw her at all. After a couple of days went by with no sign of Lauren, her friends started to get a little worried. They started texting her and calling her phone just to see if she was okay. But she never picked up, and she never replied to any of their messages. One of Lauren's classmates eventually reached out to Lauren's sister. She asked her if she had heard from Lauren at all, because no one at school had seen her. Lauren's sister wrote back and told the friend not to worry. She said, "Oh no, everything is just fine. Lauren told us before she left the wedding that she was going to be locking herself away to study around the clock. I'm sure she's just focused." But this classmate wasn't convinced. It felt very uncharacteristic of Lauren not to be at the library, and it was even more strange that she wasn't answering her phone. So she called the police and asked them to do a welfare check at Lauren's apartment. A police officer went over to the apartment and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He tried the doorknob, but it was locked. The officer then walked around the outside of the building, checking the windows. He didn't see any broken glass or any obvious signs of a break-in. With no reason to force entry, the officer left. He told Lauren's friends that there was nothing more he could do unless they filed an official missing person report. A couple more days went by, and there was still no word from Lauren. At this point, her family was now becoming very concerned. They officially filed a missing persons report. The police went back to Lauren's apartment. Again, they knocked, and again, there was no answer. The door was still locked. This time, they got the owner of the apartment building to come and open the door for them. When they went inside, Lauren wasn't there. At first glance, the apartment looked normal. But then they noticed something deeply unsettling. Her cell phone, her keys, her purse, and her laptop were all there, left behind. This immediately made the police suspect that something sinister might have happened. They started asking Lauren's friends and family if she had any enemies, or if there was any reason she might be fearful for her life. Initially, everyone said no. They said Lauren was loved by everybody and that no one would ever want to hurt her. But then, Lauren's sister remembered a strange comment Lauren had made about a year earlier. It hadn't seemed important at the time, but now it felt chillingly relevant. Lauren had just gotten back from a vacation, and when she went into her apartment, she noticed that some things had been moved. It felt like someone had been inside while she was away. She told her sister about it, but with no proof and no reasonable explanation, the incident was quickly forgotten. Lauren was so busy with law school that she didn't pursue it. After searching the inside of Lauren's apartment, the police moved their investigation to the exterior of the building. And that's when they made a horrifying discovery. An officer was looking in a dumpster near the building when he noticed a large black trash bag that seemed out of place. When he tried to move it, he realized it was very heavy. The officers opened the bag, and inside they found a human torso. It was later identified as Lauren's. Just moments before this discovery was made, a local news crew had shown up outside the apartment building. They had received a tip that a resident had been missing for over a week and that police were now on the scene. As they were setting up, they saw a young man who appeared to be a resident of the building. He was watching the police investigation and looked visibly shaken. The news crew decided to go over and interview him. It turned out his name was Stephen McDaniel. He was Lauren's next-door neighbor, and he was also a classmate of hers in law school. The interviewer asked Stephen what his last interaction with Lauren had been. Stephen became very focused and explained in detail that he hadn't seen her in the last week. He said, speaking on behalf of his other classmates, that no one had seen her. He then added, she must have just vanished. As they were conducting this interview, just on the other side of a bush, a police officer was discovering Lauren's torso. Word of the discovery quickly spread through the officers on the scene, and the news crew overheard it. The interviewer said out loud to Stephen, "It looks like they found a body." In that instant, Stephen's entire demeanor changed. He just stared at the reporter and said, "A body?" And then he went completely silent. He had a blank, distant look on his face. The interviewer, seeing his reaction, asked him, "Are you okay?" But Stephen just stood there for a few more seconds before walking away from the camera. He sat down on the ground with his back turned to them and began to hyperventilate. The interview was over. Once the case officially shifted from a missing person investigation to a homicide, the police began searching all the rooms on Lauren's floor. Stephen's room was right next to Lauren's, so his was the first one they searched. As they began the search, Stephen stood just outside his open door. He was sweating profusely and drank more than 10 bottles of water in a short period of time. Inside his apartment, they found a master key that opened Lauren's door. They learned that whenever she was gone, he would sneak into her apartment. He would copy the contents of her computer's hard drive and steal small personal items like articles of clothing, which he would hoard in his room. When they examined Stephen's computer, they checked his browser history. It was almost exclusively dedicated to looking at Lauren's Facebook and LinkedIn profiles, but the creepiest thing they found was a camera that had been duct taped to a long pole. On the camera's memory card were surveillance videos of Lauren. He had been using the pole to hoist the camera up to her windows, filming her late at night without her knowledge. Stephen McDaniel was quickly charged with Lauren's murder. He pleaded guilty and openly confessed to the horrific details of what he had done. He told the court that he usually used his spy camera to confirm when Lauren was not in her apartment so he could sneak in. But on the night he killed her, he used it to confirm that she was home and asleep. After watching her for a while, he put on a mask and used his key to let himself into her apartment. He walked quietly into her bedroom, but the sound of his entry woke her up. According to Stephen, she sat up in bed and said, "You need to leave." At that point, he jumped on the bed and attacked her. In the struggle, his mask came off. Lauren recognized him. It was her neighbor, her classmate, Stephen. She pleaded with him, calling him by his name, begging him to stop. But he didn't. He strangled her to death. Afterwards, he dragged her body into her bathroom and dismembered her. Some of the remains were flushed down the toilet. The rest were put into trash bags. Only one of those bags, the one containing her torso, was ever found. Stephen McDaniel was given a life sentence for his crimes. But some of these stories don't really end when the video stops. They stay with the people who lived them. And sometimes they stay with the people who only heard them. Remember, there are more cases waiting for you, stories that seem impossible until you realize they actually happened. Until next time. Mount Fuji, standing majestically at 3,776 meters, is the highest peak in Japan. To millions around the world, its perfectly symmetrical snow-capped cone is a symbol of serenity, beauty, and spiritual peace. However, beneath this picturesque facade lies a volatile nature. Not only is Mount Fuji an active stratovolcano, but during the winter months, it transforms into an incredibly treacherous environment. Severe blizzards, sub-zero temperatures, gale-force winds, and sheets of solid, unyielding ice turn the scenic slopes into a deadly trap. For this reason, official climbing season is strictly limited to the summer months between July and September. During the winter, the mountain is officially closed to the public. Yet, there are no physical barriers or security guards stationed at the base of the mountain to stop determined individuals. Climbing during the off-season is a matter of personal responsibility and immense risk. While experienced mountaineers with specialized training, ice axes, heavy-duty crampons, and cold-weather gear can successfully navigate the winter peak, anyone else attempting the climb is inviting disaster. In the late autumn of 2019, a 47-year-old Japanese man, known online as Tedu and to some viewers as Tedzu, decided to challenge the mountain. Tedu was an internet streamer and a thrill-seeker, but he was by no means a mountaineer. He lacked the physical conditioning, the survival training, and, most fatally, the correct equipment. His goal was not just to summit Mount Fuji in dangerous conditions, but to broadcast the entire journey live to his online audience on a popular streaming platform. He believed the extreme setting would attract a massive crowd of viewers seeking validation and fame from the digital world. On the morning of his climb, Tedu arrived at the Subashiri Trail. The weather at the base was chilly but seemingly manageable. However, his choice of gear immediately signaled trouble to anyone with basic hiking knowledge. Instead of specialized insulated layers, waterproof clothing, and mountaineering boots, Tedu wore basic street clothes. He carried lightweight trekking poles, which are useful for dirt paths but entirely useless on hard ice. Most importantly, he lacked crampons, the sharp metal spikes attached to boots that allow a climber to bite into ice, and an ice axe, the ultimate tool for stopping a sudden slide down a slope. His most vital piece of equipment, in his own eyes, was his smartphone attached to a selfie stick. As Tedu turned on his live stream and began his ascent, the broadcast started on a cheerful note. He chatted casually with his audience, commenting on the volcanic ash beneath his feet and the beautiful scenery. Early on, viewers tuned in out of curiosity, sending words of encouragement and digital gifts. The steady stream of real-time comments and notifications acted as a powerful psychological anchor, fueling his determination to keep moving forward. However, as Tedu pushed higher up the mountain, the environment began to change drastically. The dirt and volcanic ash gave way to patches of snow, which quickly turned into continuous sheets of hard, slippery ice. The ambient temperature plummeted well below freezing, and the wind began to howl, whipping up loose snow and drastically reducing visibility. Tedu's physical condition began to deteriorate rapidly.
Because he was only wearing regular clothes, the extreme cold began to seep into his body. On screen, viewers watched as Taedu began to hyperventilate. He openly complained to his audience that his fingers were becoming completely numb and losing all sensation. He struggled to hold his smartphone steady, and his hands shook violently. At this point, the nature of the live chat began to shift. Several experienced hikers in the audience realized the gravity of the situation. They began typing urgent messages, pleading with him to turn back, warning him that frostbite was setting in and that the upper slopes were too dangerous. But Taedu was trapped in a psychological phenomenon known as the sunk cost fallacy, compounded by the pressure of a live audience. He felt he had already climbed too high and invested too much effort to simply give up. He also feared disappointing his viewers and losing the digital spotlight. Every time he looked at his phone, he saw the viewer count rising. Misinterpreting this morbid curiosity as support, he pressed on, dismissing the warnings. As he neared the steep final stretch just below the summit, the trail became incredibly narrow and steep. The safety ropes and fences installed for summer tourists were completely buried under feet of ice or dismantled. The terrain was now a literal sheet of glass, tilted at a brutal angle. Taedu was forced to rely entirely on his lightweight trekking poles, which bounced uselessly off the hard ice instead of digging in. His regular shoes had absolutely no traction. The live stream captured his final, agonizing minutes. Taedu was slipping constantly, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He noted aloud how incredibly steep the slope had become and how dangerous the footing looked. Yet, he took another step forward. Suddenly, the camera angle jerked violently. The smooth motion of his walk broke. Taedu had lost his footing on a patch of black ice. "Wait! I'm slipping!" Taedu cried out, his voice instantly shifting from exhaustion to pure panic. Because he lacked an ice axe, he had no way to perform a self-arrest, a technique where a climber throws their body weight onto an axe to dig into the mountain and stop a fall. Without it, the steep, icy slope acted like a massive, frictionless slide. Taedu began to slide down the mountainside, gaining speed with every passing second. The smartphone, still broadcasting live, spun wildly, showing chaotic, terrifying blurs of white snow, blue sky, and the steep drop below. Taedu's voice could be heard over the rushing wind, uttering his final chilling words. Well, it can't be helped. It was a phrase of grim resignation, a realization that he had made a fatal mistake and there was absolutely nothing he could do to fix it. The thousands of viewers watching the stream could only look on in absolute horror as the camera suddenly froze, showing a still image of a trekking pole resting on the snow before the connection cut to absolute silence. The next day, search and rescue teams deployed a helicopter to scour the treacherous winter slopes of Mount Fuji. Given the extreme speed of his slide, Taedu had traveled an immense distance down the mountain in a matter of seconds. Rescue workers eventually located his lifeless body at an altitude of approximately 2,700 meters more than 1,000 meters below the point where he had slipped. The brutal fall down the rocky, icy mountainside had killed him instantly. He had traded his life for a temporary surge in internet viewership, leaving behind a haunting digital record of his own final moments. In the turbulent landscape of late 20th century Mexico, few figures loomed as large or as tragically as Rosalino Chelino Sanchez. Born in 1962 into grinding poverty in the rural, cartel-dominated state of Sinaloa, Chelino's life was practically destined to be shaped by violence. Sinaloa was a place where local disputes were settled with gunfire and where the line between folk heroes and outlaws was often blurred. For Chelino, this brutal reality struck early and intimately. When he was just a teenager, a local, wealthy, and powerful man assaulted his sister. In a society where justice from the authorities was a rare commodity, a 7-year-old Chelino took matters into his own hands. He tracked the man down to a local party and shot him dead, avenging his family's honor. Knowing that remaining in Sinaloa meant certain death or imprisonment, Chelino fled across the border into the United States. Settling in California, he survived by working various undocumented jobs, eventually teaming up with his brother, Armando, to operate a human smuggling ring. For a time, it seemed Cellino had escaped the cycle of violence, but Sinaloa's dark shadow caught up with him once more. In 1984, Armando was brutally murdered in a Tijuana hotel room. Devastated by the loss, Cellino sought a way to preserve his brother's memory and process his immense grief. He chose music. Cellino began writing corridos, traditional Mexican narrative ballads that historically told stories of the Mexican Revolution. However, Cellino modernized the genre, transforming it into narco-corridos, drug ballads. He did not sing about fictional heroes. Instead, he wrote raw, unvarnished, and deeply authentic songs about real-world cartel bosses, smugglers, gunfights, and betrayals. While spent time in a Tijuana prison for minor offenses, other inmates, many of whom were dangerous cartel soldiers, began hiring him to write ballads detailing their own exploits. Cellino possessed a rare gift. He could translate the gritty, violent realities of the criminal underworld into poetic, captivating lyrics. When he was released, his reputation exploded. Cellino's voice was untrained, raspy, and distinct, but what he lacked in classical vocal talent, he more than made up for in sheer authenticity. He sang with the conviction of a man who had lived through the very bloodshed he described. To the thousands of Mexican immigrants living in the United States and the youth back in Mexico, Cellino became an overnight cultural icon, pioneering a subgenre of music that would dominate the airwaves for decades. As his fame grew, so did the danger. In the world of narco-corridos, singing the praises of one cartel boss inevitably meant insulting a rival faction. Cellino knew he was constantly walking a tightrope, but he refused to back down. His legendary status was cemented in January 1992 during a performance at a club in Coachella, California. In the middle of his set, an armed man jumped onto the stage and pulled out a pistol, firing directly at the singer. Instead of running or ducking for cover, Cellino pulled a handgun from his own waistband and engaged in a fierce, close-quarters shootout with the assassin right in front of a terrified, screaming crowd. Though Cellino was hit in the torso and critical condition, he survived. The assassin was subdued, but the chaotic exchange left one bystander dead and several injured. This incident did not destroy Cellino's career, it turned him into a living myth. He was no longer just a musician singing about violence, he was a man who lived by the gun and was willing to die by it. He became the ultimate symbol of the unyielding, fearless outlaw. However, Cellino was a realist. He knew that surviving the Coachella shootout had only bought him a little time. He openly told friends and family that his days were numbered and that his enemies would eventually find a way to finish the job. 4 months later, in May 1992, Cellino made a fateful decision to return to his homeland of Sinaloa for a highly anticipated promotional tour. His triumphant homecoming culminated on the night of May 15th at the Salon Bugambilias in Culiacan. The venue was packed to the brim with passionate fans eager to see their idol return to the soil that birthed his music. The atmosphere was electric, but the undercurrent of danger was palpable. Just as Cellino was preparing to sing one of his most famous tracks, an unidentified man in the crowd stepped forward and handed a small piece of paper to someone on stage, who then passed it directly to the singer. The moment was captured perfectly on a fan's camcorder, preserving one of the most haunting images in music history. As Cellino unfolded the note and read it silently, his entire demeanor shattered. The tough, untouchable outlaw persona vanished in an instant. His face grew incredibly pale, his eyes widened with a mixture of profound shock and deep sorrow, and a heavy sweat broke out across his forehead. He wiped his brow, staring blankly out into the crowd, as the weight of the universe seemed to settle on his shoulders. The note was an explicit, undeniable death threat from the local cartels. It stated quite simply, "If you sing tonight, this will be your last performance. We are going to kill you as soon as you step off the stage." For a long, agonizing few seconds, Cellino stood frozen. He looked at the paper, then crumpled it up and stuffed it into his pocket. He had 2 choices. He could drop the microphone, flee the stage under guard and try to hide, or he could give his people what they came for. Choosing the path of a true artist, Cellino signaled the band to start playing. He looked out at the audience, smiled through his fear, and delivered what many witnesses later described as the most passionate, haunting, and flawless performance of his entire life. He sang every lyric as if it were a final confession, knowing with absolute certainty that every breath he took on that stage brought him closer to his demise. When the concert concluded, Cellino did not rush away. He intentionally lingered on the stage, waving to his fans and saying an extended, emotional goodbye to his band members, knowing he would never see them again. Hours later, in the early morning of May 16th, Cellino left the venue in a caravan with his brothers and cousins. As their vehicles navigated the dark streets of Culiacan, they were suddenly intercepted by a group of heavily armed men driving suburban vehicles. The men flashed badges claiming to be state police officers and demanded that Cellino step out of the vehicle. Recognizing the reality of the situation, Cellino complied to protect his family. He willingly got into their car and disappeared into the night. A few hours later, two farmers walking near an irrigation canal on the outskirts of Culiacan discovered a body dumped in the dirt. It was Cellino Sanchez. He was blindfolded, his wrists and ankles bore severe rope burns from being bound, and he had been shot twice in the back of the head, executed in classic cartel fashion at just 29 years old. Cellino's final moments on stage, captured forever on film, remain an indelible testament to a man who looked his own mortality directly in the eyes and chose to sing his heart out anyway. The 25th of September, 1978, began as a picture-perfect morning in Southern California. The sky over San Diego was a flawless, brilliant blue, completely devoid of clouds. Visibility was virtually unlimited, extending for miles in every direction. For aviation professionals, it was the kind of pristine weather that promised an effortless day of flying. Among the thousands of people traveling through the air that morning were the passengers and crew of Pacific Southwest Airlines PSA Flight 182. PSA was a beloved regional airline affectionately known for its bright, cheerful brand. The company famously painted a black smile beneath the nose cone of every aircraft, earning them the nickname the Grinning Birds. The flight crew on duty was highly experienced. At the controls was Captain James McFerrin, a veteran pilot with over 14,000 hours of flight time, accompanied by First Officer Robert Fox and Flight Engineer Martin Wan. Flight 182 was a Boeing 727-200 commercial airliner en route from Sacramento to San Diego's Lindbergh Field, carrying 128 passengers and 7 crew members. Many on board were PSA employees commuting to work or heading home, creating a relaxed, friendly atmosphere in the cabin. At the same time, a completely different type of aviation operation was taking place in the very same airspace. A small, single-engine Cessna 172 was flying on a training mission. Inside the tiny cockpit were 2 men, David Boswell, a 35-year-old Marine Corps sergeant practicing instrument landing approaches, and his instructor, Martin Kazi, a seasoned 32-year-old pilot. They were practicing a series of specific maneuvers under the guidance of San Diego's Air Traffic Control, ATC. Because the weather was so exceptionally clear, the air traffic controllers instructed the crew of PSA Flight 182 to transition from instrument flight rules to visual flight rules, VFR. Under VFR, the ultimate responsibility for maintaining a safe distance from other aircraft shifts from the controllers on the ground to the eyes of the pilots in the cockpit. It is a fundamental rule of the skies: see and avoid. As the massive Boeing 727 began its descent into the San Diego area, the approach controller radioed Captain McFerrin, alerting him to the presence of the small Cessna ahead of them. The controller stated that the Cessna was maintaining an altitude of about 3,500 feet and heading in a similar direction. Captain McFerrin acknowledged the warning, and First Officer Fox quickly spotted a small plane outside his window. "Got him," Fox said, reporting to the captain that they had the traffic in sight. However, a fatal misunderstanding was quietly unfolding inside the Boeing's cockpit. The air traffic controller had warned them about Boswell and Kazi's Cessna 172. But because San Diego's skies were always busy, the PSA pilots had actually spotted a completely different third aircraft that happened to be flying in the vicinity. Unaware that they were looking at the wrong plane, the crew assumed the primary threat had already passed safely behind them. A few moments later, Flight 182 was handed over to the Lindbergh Field Airport Tower Controller. The tower controller, assuming the PSA crew was still actively watching the Cessna they had originally discussed, told them to maintain visual separation. Inside the cockpit, confusion began to brew. The pilots began to question where the Cessna actually was. "I think he's passed off to our right," Captain McFerrin muttered, looking out into the blue sky. "Yeah," First Officer Fox responded, though his voice carried a hint of uncertainty. The cockpit voice recorder would later reveal that the crew wasn't entirely sure. They began discussing the target in fragmented sentences. At one point, a voice in the cockpit murmured, "I hope so." Unfortunately, instead of asking air traffic control for an explicit clarification or requesting radar assistance to pinpoint the rogue aircraft, the crew allowed the conversation to drift. They assumed everything was fine. Meanwhile, the Cessna was flying directly ahead of the giant airliner. Because it was much smaller and slower, the Boeing 727 was rapidly gaining on it from behind. Crucially, due to the high-nosed pitch of the Boeing 727 as it prepared for landing, the Cessna fell directly into a catastrophic blind spot. It was positioned directly beneath the nose and cockpit floor of the airliner. The PSA pilots could look forward and sideways all they wanted, but it was physically impossible for them to see the small plane directly beneath their feet. Down on the ground, the automated conflict alert system at the air traffic control center began to flash and sound an alarm, indicating that the radar paths of the two planes were about to merge. The controller noticed the warning, but chose not to issue an urgent, evasive command to the PSA jet. Because the PSA pilots had explicitly stated earlier that they had the traffic, the controller assumed the commercial pilots were fully aware of the Cessna and were intentionally passing close by it. The controller merely radioed the Cessna crew to inform them of the fast-approaching jet. At exactly 9:47 a.m., the unthinkable happened. The massive belly and right wing of the Boeing 727 slammed into the tiny Cessna from behind at an altitude of approximately 2,600 feet. The impact was violent and instantaneous. The Cessna disintegrated into a ball of fire, its fuselage breaking into pieces and tearing into the right wing of the airliner. The collision completely shattered the internal hydraulic lines inside the Boeing's right wing, rendering the flaps and control surfaces entirely useless. The right wing erupted into flames. Inside the cockpit of Flight 182, a blaring chorus of master caution, alarms, and fire warnings filled the air. The plane instantly rolled violently to the right, its nose dipping down into an unrecoverable steep dive toward the earth. Despite the terrifying forces pulling at the aircraft, Captain McFerrin and his crew displayed incredible professionalism, fighting the controls until the very end. Realizing that the hydraulic fluid was completely gone and the plane was unresponsive, McFerrin keyed his microphone to radio his final transmission to the tower. "Tower, we're going down. This is PSA," he said, his voice remarkably steady despite the circumstances. "Okay," the tower controller replied, unaware of the scale of the disaster. "We'll call the equipment for you." Inside the cabin, passengers were thrown against their seats as the ground rushed up at a terrifying speed of over 300 miles per hour. In those final, agonizing seconds, the cockpit voice recorder captured a deeply human moment. Amidst the mechanical wailing of the dying aircraft, the crew said their final goodbyes. "Easy, baby," a voice muttered, trying to soothe the dying machine. Then, just before impact, a final voice whispered over the intercom, "I love you, Mom." At 9:07 a.m., just 20 seconds after the collision, PSA Flight 182 slammed directly into the residential neighborhood of North Park, San Diego, exploding in a massive fireball that sent a column of black smoke thousands of feet into the air. The impact demolished an entire city block, destroying 22 homes. All 135 people on board the Boeing, both pilots in the Cessna, and 7 people on the ground were killed instantly, bringing the total death toll to 144. It was, at the time, the deadliest aviation disaster in United States history, a heartbreaking catastrophe born from a single, quiet moment of visual confusion in a perfectly clear sky. Human beings are hardwired to fear heights. It is an evolutionary survival mechanism designed to keep us away from steep drops and unstable edges. For 5-year-old Yenya Gomez, this fear was not just a passing discomfort, it was a deeply rooted, lifelong phobia. Yenya was a successful, intelligent young lawyer living in Colombia. She was known to her friends and family as someone who was generally cautious, analytical, and reserved. However, like many people who struggle with intense anxieties, Yenya harbored a quiet desire to conquer her fears. She wanted to prove to herself that she was stronger than the phobias that sought to control her. In July of 2021, an opportunity arose to face her ultimate fear. Her boyfriend, an adventure enthusiast, suggested they go bungee jumping. The location was a notorious hotspot for thrill-seekers in the mountainous region of Amaga, located near the vibrant city of Medellin. The jumping platform was built onto an old, abandoned railway bridge that spanned a massive, breathtaking gorge. Suspended hundreds of feet above a dense green jungle canopy and a rocky riverbed, the bridge was both beautiful and utterly terrifying. To Yenya, looking down into that vast chasm was the definition of a nightmare. Yet, with her boyfriend by her side offering constant encouragement, she made the brave decision to sign up. She wanted to step off that ledge and feel the weight of her fear vanish. However, the reality of the experience began to fall apart the moment they arrived at the site. Because it was a popular weekend, the bridge was completely overwhelmed with tourists. The local adventure company running the operation was struggling to keep up with the massive crowd, resulting in chaotic organization and extremely long delays. Yenya and her boyfriend were forced to stand in a tightly packed queue on the narrow bridge for several agonizing hours. For someone already battling a severe phobia, this extended waiting period was a psychological disaster. Instead of getting the jump over with quickly to experience a rush of relief, Yenya was trapped with her thoughts. For hours, she had to stand on the edge, listening to the rushing wind, looking down into the abyss, and watching person after person scream as they plummeted off the platform. This prolonged exposure did not desensitize her. Instead, it triggered a massive, compounding panic attack. Her heart rate began to skyrocket, her breathing became shallow and rapid, and a heavy sense of dread clouded her mind. Her brain entered a state of pure fight or flight, a condition where logical reasoning shuts down and the body focuses entirely on surviving the perceived threat. She was no longer jumping for fun. She was in a desperate, frantic hurry to get the ordeal over with so she could escape the suffocating anxiety. Finally, after hours of mental torture, their names were called. The couple stepped onto the wooden jumping platform. Due to the high volume of customers and the noise of the wind, the instructors were rushing through their safety checks, trying to move people through the line as quickly as possible. Yenya was in a state of near-blind panic, suffering from a psychological phenomenon known as tunnel vision or auditory exclusion. When a human being is engulfed by extreme terror, their brain filters out peripheral sights and sounds, focusing only on the immediate center of attention. For Yenya, the entire world had shrunk down to the edge of the wooden platform and the voice of the jump instructor. The instructors began preparing the couple. They slipped a heavy, secure body harness around Yenya's torso. This harness was designed to distribute the force of the fall across her chest and waist. However, in bungee jumping, the actual heavy-duty elastic cord is not always attached directly to the torso harness first. It is often clamped securely onto separate ankle straps or a primary carabiner once the jumper is fully positioned at the absolute edge of the platform. The crew had just finished tightening Yenya's torso straps and were in the middle of preparing the equipment for her boyfriend who was fully rigged and ready to go. Suddenly, one of the instructors looked up, gestured toward the edge, and shouted over the roaring wind, "Okay, jump!" The instructor's command was explicitly intended for Yenia's boyfriend. He was the one whose ropes were checked, cleared, and securely locked into the safety system. Yenia, however, was in no state to process context. Hearing the word jump, her panic-stricken brain fired an instantaneous signal. She completely misunderstood the situation, assuming the command was directed at her. She thought her nightmare was finally supposed to end. Before anyone could realize what was happening or reach out a hand to restrain her, Yenia took a decisive, brave step forward and launched herself off the edge of the railway bridge. The horror that followed was instantaneous. The instructors had only put the body harness on her. They had not yet attached the bungee cord to her body or her ankles. The elastic rope was still lying coiled on the wooden floor of the platform. Yenia had leaped into the open air with absolutely nothing connecting her to the bridge. Her boyfriend and the crew could only watch in silent, paralyzed shock as Yenia plummeted like a stone, accelerating rapidly as she fell hundreds of feet down toward the rocky valley below. Her boyfriend immediately threw off his equipment, desperately scrambled off the platform, and began a frantic, terrifying race down the steep, jungle-covered mountainside to reach the bottom of the gorge. When emergency services and her traumatized boyfriend finally located Yenia's body resting in the dense brush at the base of the canyon, medical professionals rushed to her side. Sadly, the immense impact of the fall had killed her, and there was nothing anyone could do. However, the most haunting and tragic detail of the entire event was uncovered days later during the official medical autopsy. When the forensic pathologists completed their examination of her body, they made a shocking discovery. Yenia had not died from the catastrophic physical trauma caused by impacting the ground. Instead, the medical report concluded that Yenia Gomez had suffered a massive fatal heart attack while she was still falling through the air. The sheer terror of the realization had killed her before she ever hit the ground. In those terrifying, weightless seconds of her descent, as the wind rushed past her and the ground zoomed closer, Yenia's mind must have registered the horrific truth. There was no tension pulling at her harness, no elastic cord snapping her back up toward the sky. She realized she was falling completely unprotected. The sudden, overwhelming surge of pure terror and adrenaline was too much for her heart to bear, causing it to fail completely. It remains a deeply heartbreaking reminder of how a single moment of miscommunication, amplified by the crippling weight of human fear, can lead to an irreversible tragedy. In the realm of modern industrial manufacturing, mass-produced food relies heavily on automation, massive machinery, and rigid schedules. In these environments, time is literally money. For large-scale commercial bakeries, a single hour of halted production can result in thousands of dollars in lost revenue, wasted raw ingredients, and delayed shipments to supermarkets. Tragically, when corporate entities prioritize profit margins and production quotas over basic human safety protocols, the consequences are often catastrophic. This was precisely the environment that set the stage for one of the most horrifying industrial workplace accidents in modern British history. The setting was the Fresha Bakery, a large commercial bread-producing facility located in Leicester, England. At the heart of the factory's operations was a massive, industrial tunnel oven. This colossal machine was roughly 80 feet, about 24 meters long, a giant, enclosed metal structure designed to bake thousands of loaves of bread continuously as they moved through its interior on a slow-moving automated conveyor belt. Because of its immense size and insulation, the oven required a massive amount of energy to heat up and, conversely, an incredibly long time to cool down. In May of 1998, a mechanical issue arose inside the giant oven. One of the heavy metal gears that drove the internal conveyor belt had failed, causing a disruption in the baking line. Under standard, legally mandated safety guidelines, the protocol for repairing such a machine was clear and uncompromising. The oven had to be shut down completely, and maintenance crews were required to wait at least 24 hours to allow the massive metal structure to cool down to a safe ambient temperature before anyone could attempt to enter. However, to the management at Fresha Bakery, a 2-4-hour shutdown was completely unacceptable. The factory was running on a tight schedule, and stopping production for a full day meant losing approximately $1,500 for every single hour the oven sat idle, on top of the steep costs of hiring specialized external technicians. Seeking a shortcut to save both time and money, the factory management devised a highly dangerous, unauthorized plan. Instead of shutting the oven down and waiting for it to cool, they decided to perform the repairs on the fly. They turned off the heavy gas burners and lowered the temperature settings to the absolute minimum, but they left the internal conveyor belt running. The plan required human workers to physically enter the active oven. The management removed a few specific metal plates from the conveyor belt, creating a narrow gap in the track. The strategy was for a worker to crawl through a small maintenance panel on the side of the oven, slide into the narrow gap on the moving conveyor track, and walk slowly in a hunched position inside the dark tunnel. Because the belt was moving forward, the worker would have to constantly walk at the exact same speed as the conveyor, keeping pace with the machine while searching for the broken gear, fixing it, and then riding the belt out to the exit on the other side. To execute this hazardous task, the management looked for volunteers within their own workforce, offering an attractive financial bonus for anyone willing to step inside. 2 experienced factory workers volunteered: 4-year-old Ian Erickson and 7-year-old David Mays. Both men were dedicated employees, and on that particular evening, they had an additional motivation for wanting the job done quickly. There was a highly anticipated football match airing on television later that night, and both Ian and David wanted to finish their shift as early as possible so they could go home and watch the game with their families. Driven by this desire to expedite the process, the 2 men approached the factory supervisor and asked if they could enter the oven ahead of schedule. The supervisor, eager to get the production line running again, walked over to the side entrance of the massive machine. Instead of looking at the internal temperature gauges or using a proper digital thermometer to verify the actual conditions inside the core of the oven, the supervisor simply placed his bare hand near the air vent. Feeling a stream of cool air from an external ventilation fan blowing near the entrance, he assumed the interior was safe. He gave Ian and David the green light to proceed. Equipped with basic tools and a handheld radio to communicate with the team outside, Ian and David crawled through the small side hatch and stepped into the gap on the moving conveyor belt. Almost immediately, the air hatch was sealed behind them, and they began their slow, forced march through the pitch-black, narrow metal tunnel. For the first few minutes, everything seemed to be going according to plan. But as the conveyor belt carried the 2 men deeper into the dark, enclosed core of the 80-foot structure, the environment transformed into a literal hell. The supervisor's hand test at the entrance had been entirely deceptive. While the outer edges of the oven were cooled by the fans, the deep center of the massive industrial machine had retained a colossal amount of residual heat. About 5 minutes into the operation, Ian's voice crackled over the handheld radio. He informed the supervisor that the air was becoming uncomfortably warm. The supervisor, downplaying the danger, told them it was normal and urged them to keep moving forward. But within seconds, the temperature plummeted them into a panic. The heat in the core of the oven was radiating violently from the thick metal walls and the floor beneath their feet. "No, it's too hot in here!" Ian screamed into the radio, his voice suddenly filled with sheer terror. "It's incredibly hot, we can't breathe!" Horrified by the desperation in the worker's voice, the manager finally ran over to check the main control panel's digital temperature gauges. To his profound horror, the monitors revealed that the temperature in the center of the oven was resting at well over 200 degrees Fahrenheit, more than 93 degrees Celsius, a temperature hot enough to easily boil water and inflict severe, third-degree burns within seconds. A frantic, chaotic panic erupted outside the oven, but the management quickly realized they had trapped the men in an unrecoverable cage. Because of the oven's design, the massive conveyor belt could only move in one direction. It physically could not be reversed. Furthermore, the tunnel was so incredibly narrow and tightly engineered that Ian and David could not turn around or crawl backward without being instantly caught, crushed and torn apart by the heavy internal gears and chains surrounding the track. Their only hope of survival was to keep walking forward toward the exit at the far end. However, the conveyor belt moved at an agonizingly slow, automated pace. It took a full 17 minutes for a single section of the belt to travel from the entrance to the exit. For over 10 minutes, the entire factory floor stood in paralyzed horror as the agonizing, desperate screams of Ian and David echoed continuously through the handheld radio. They were being cooked alive in total darkness, unable to escape the suffocating, boiling air. Desperate to save their friends, other factory workers grabbed heavy tools, axes, and crowbars, frantically hammering at the thick, insulated metal exterior of the oven, trying to breach the walls. But the industrial plating was too thick to break. By the time the conveyor belt finally reached the exit hatch, the screams over the radio had completely stopped. When the hatch opened, the rescue crew dragged Ian Erickson out of the machine. The extreme heat had overwhelmed his respiratory system and inflicted catastrophic thermal burns across his entire body. He had died of heat stroke and suffocation seconds before reaching the exit. David Mays, trailing slightly behind, had lost consciousness due to the extreme heat in the center of the oven, collapsed onto the moving track, and was subsequently caught and fatally crushed by the heavy machinery near the exit terminal. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the community and led to a massive investigation by health and safety authorities. The company was found guilty of extreme negligence and corporate manslaughter, receiving massive financial penalties, while the individual managers faced severe legal repercussions. The heartbreaking loss of Ian and David remains a grim, definitive example of the horrific cost of corporate greed, serving as a permanent warning of what happens when human lives are compromised for the sake of industrial efficiency. The forces of nature are often perceived as slow, predictable, and distant. We walk on paved roads, park our cars on solid concrete, and trust that the ground beneath our feet is unyielding. However, beneath the surface of our modern cities lies a complex, invisible network of infrastructure that, when combined with natural geological processes, can transform a mundane afternoon into a waking nightmare. Among all the sudden geological hazards, few are as terrifying or as inescapable as the sinkhole. By definition, a sinkhole is a massive depression or hole in the ground caused by some form of collapse of the surface layer. Most commonly, they form when water either from heavy rainfall, natural underground rivers, or ruptured internal water mains slowly dissolves the soluble bedrock layer, such as limestone or salt beds, underneath the soil. Over months or years, the water hollows out immense, vacant caverns beneath the earth, leaving only a thin, fragile crust of topsoil and asphalt above. To anyone walking on the surface, everything looks perfectly normal. But underneath, there is nothing but an empty, echoing void. When the weight on the surface finally exceeds the structural strength of that remaining thin crust, the ground breaks open instantly. If an unfortunate individual happens to fall into a large sinkhole, their chances of survival are astronomically low. Unlike a regular pit, the ground inside a sinkhole after the initial implosion does not remain stable. It continues to sink, crumble, and churn like a massive vortex of quicksand beneath one's feet. Even if a victim manages to scramble to the sides of the chasm, escaping is physically impossible. The surrounding soil is completely loose, wet, and unstable, offering absolutely no handholds or traction. You are essentially trapped in a shifting, subterranean cage that slowly pulls you deeper into the earth. Fortunately, most natural sinkholes form gradually, giving geological experts and local residents plenty of warning signs, such as cracked foundations, tilted trees, or small depressions in the dirt. But when human engineering fails beneath the streets, a sinkhole can appear out of nowhere in the blink of an eye. This is precisely what happened in the heart of winter in the Russian Federation. To understand the unique horror of the disaster that unfolded, one must understand how modern Russian cities survive the brutal sub-zero winter months. In many parts of Russia, individual residential and commercial buildings do not have their own independent heating furnaces. Instead, municipalities rely on a centralized district heating system. Massive industrial municipal plants boil colossal volumes of water and pump it through a vast, sprawling network of heavy-duty underground pipes directly into businesses, schools, and apartment complexes across the city. This water is not merely warm, it is pushed through the grid at boiling temperatures, radiating intense heat to keep entire communities from freezing to death. On the morning of the 19th of November 2019, in the Russian city of Penza, a historic industrial hub located approximately 340 miles south of Moscow, this vital life-saving infrastructure turned into a weapon of mass destruction. Deep beneath the asphalt of a busy local grocery store car park, a massive, high-pressure central heating pipe suddenly burst. Initially, nobody in the area had any idea that a catastrophic failure had occurred. The rupture happened several meters underground, hidden entirely from view. However, thousands of gallons of pressurized boiling water began to erupt from the broken pipe, violently washing away the packed sand, dirt, and stone foundation supporting the parking lot above. Within hours, the boiling torrent had carved out a massive hollow cavern directly beneath the asphalt. As the morning progressed, a few local witnesses walking past the car park noticed something unusual. Thin, ghostly plumes of white steam were gently rising from the cracks in the asphalt near the parked cars. In the freezing Russian winter air, however, seeing steam or heat radiating from underground vents was a common sight. None of the bystanders thought anything of it. They assumed it was a minor, routine venting of the city's heating system. No one mullah suspected that the solid-looking asphalt of the parking lot was now nothing more than a fragile, hollow shell suspended over a roaring reservoir of boiling water and liquid mud. A short time later, a gray Lada Larga station wagon pulled into the car park. Inside the vehicle were two local men aged 49 and 53 who had driven to the store to run a few ordinary daily errands. The driver navigated the vehicle through the lot, looking for an open space, and slowly steered the car directly toward the area where the steam was rising. The moment the heavy front tires of the Lada rolled onto that specific patch of asphalt, the fragile crust completely gave way under the vehicle's weight. The ground did not just crack, it imploded violently. In a fraction of a second, a massive, gaping sinkhole tore open beneath the car. The front of the Lada dropped instantly into the abyss, and the entire vehicle flipped forward, plunging upside down into a deep chasm filled to the brim with raging, churning water that had reached temperatures of over 170 degrees Fahrenheit, 75 degrees Celsius. The horror of the situation was immediate and absolute. The vehicle was completely submerged in the boiling pit, and the impact of the fall jammed the car doors tightly against the crumbling, shifting walls of the sinkhole. Terrified, bystanders rushed toward the edge of the pit, desperate to help, but they were instantly driven back by the suffocating waves of intense heat and scalding steam erupting from the hole. The boiling water quickly flooded the interior cabin of the trapped car. By the time emergency rescue services arrived at the scene with heavy cranes and specialized thermal suits, it was already too late. The churning, unstable nature of the sinkhole made the extraction process incredibly dangerous, as the edges of the pavement continued to collapse into the water. When workers finally managed to hook the vehicle and hoist the crushed Lada out of the steaming crater, they made a heartbreaking discovery. Both men inside had succumbed to severe thermal trauma and drowning within minutes of the initial collapse. The Penza sinkhole disaster remains a deeply chilling example of how quickly and quietly the ordinary world can collapse beneath us. It stands as a tragic testament to the invisible dangers hidden within our industrial societies, where a simple drive to the grocery store can end in a sudden, inescapable struggle against a boiling abyss. In the realm of modern music history, there are very few artists who truly lived the brutal realities they sang about. For Rosalino Chileno Sanchez, the pioneer of narco-corridos drug ballads, authenticity was not a marketing strategy, it was a blood-soaked reality. By the early 1990s, Chileno had transformed from a poor immigrant, fleeing a vendetta in Sinaloa, Mexico, into the undisputed king of underground Mexican music in the United States. His raw, unpolished voice resonated deeply with millions of working-class immigrants and youth who found solace in his gritty stories of smugglers, outlaws, and cartel violence. However, singing about the criminal underworld is an inherently lethal profession. In the highly volatile world of narco-corridos, immortalizing one cartel boss in a song meant instantly making an enemy of a rival faction. Chelino was fully aware that he was walking through a minefield with every performance. He knew that many of his songs had angered dangerous men, and he lived with the constant lingering knowledge that an assassination attempt was not a matter of if, but okay. Because of this ever-present danger, Chelino made it a strict personal rule never to travel unprotected. Whenever he stepped out in public or walked onto a concert stage, he carried a loaded semi-automatic handgun tucked discreetly into his waistband. This lethal convergence of music and violence reached a terrifying climax on the night of the 25th of January 1992. Chelino was scheduled to perform a highly anticipated concert at the Plaza Los Arcos, a popular nightclub in Coachella, California. The venue was completely sold out, packed to the brim with over 1,000 passionate fans who had gathered to drink, dance, and see their idol perform live. The energy in the club was electric, the air thick with anticipation as the backing band struck up the traditional brass and accordion melodies. Chelino walked onto the stage to a roaring ovation. Wearing his signature cowboy hat and a sharp suit, he immediately commanded the room. He began singing his famous ballads, his distinct, raspy voice echoing through the crowded venue. For the first part of the night, the concert was a massive success. The crowd sang along to every word, raising their glasses to the man who gave a voice to the outlaws. But hidden deep within the dense crowd of 1,000 fans was a man named Eduardo Gallegos. Gallegos was a local 32-year-old unemployed man with a history of volatile behavior. He had not come to the club to enjoy the music. He had arrived with a specific, deadly objective. Tucked away in his jacket was a loaded .25 caliber pistol. Around midnight, in the middle of Chelino's performance, Gallegos suddenly broke away from the crowd. Pushing past unsuspecting bystanders, he aggressively scrambled up onto the elevated stage, breaching the thin line of security. Before the band members or the audience could even comprehend what was happening, Gallegos marched directly toward Chelino, pulled out his handgun, and pointed it straight at the singer's chest. What happened next would permanently cement Chelino Sanchez's name into the annals of folklore. In a situation where almost any ordinary person would have panicked, frozen in fear, or begged for mercy, Chelino's survival instincts, forged in the violent streets of Sinaloa, instantly kicked in. He did not flinch, duck, or attempt to run away. Instead, as Gallegos pulled his trigger, Chelino displayed an almost supernatural level of composure. At the exact same moment the assassin fired, Chelino reached into his own waistband, pulled out his 9mm pistol, and began returning fire at point-blank range. The nightclub instantly exploded into pure, unadulterated chaos. The upbeat, festive music screeched to a sudden halt as the deafening, sharp cracks of real gunfire echoed through the speakers. A violent, chaotic gun battle erupted directly on the stage. Gallegos fired his weapon repeatedly, and one of his initial rounds tore through Chelino's torso, critically wounding the singer. Despite being shot and losing blood rapidly, Chelino stood his ground, maintaining his grip on his weapon and continuing to unleash a barrage of bullets at his attacker. Seeing their idol under fire, several brave members of the audience and Chelino's personal entourage rushed the stage. A frantic, desperate struggle ensued as they attempted to tackle and disarm Gallegos. During the wild close-quarters melee, weapons continued to discharge erratically. One of the loose firearms was grabbed by an associate who accidentally fired into the crowd, further amplifying the horror. Down on the floor of the nightclub, pure panic took over. 1,000 terrified, screaming fans scrambled over tables and chairs, desperately stampeding toward the exit doors to escape the crossfire. People threw themselves onto the floor, shielding their loved ones as bullets whistled through the air. When the smoke finally cleared and the police arrived at the bloody scene, the true scale of the carnage became apparent. Eduardo Gallegos had been shot multiple times by Chelino and was quickly tackled to the ground by the crowd, who severely beat him before handover to the authorities. Chelino Sanchez was slumped on the stage, bleeding profusely from a near-fatal gunshot wound to his abdomen. The erratic, stray bullets flying off the stage had struck several innocent bystanders. In total, 8 people were wounded, and tragically, a 20-year-old man named Claudio Renova was struck by a stray bullet and killed instantly. Chelino was rushed to a nearby hospital in critical condition. For several days, he hovered on the brink of death, undergoing emergency surgeries to repair the severe internal damage caused by the assassin's bullet. Ultimately, his strength prevailed, and he survived the horrific ordeal. The Coachella incident was a massive turning point. In the corporate music industry, a chaotic shootout that leaves a bystander dead would usually destroy an artist's career, making them too dangerous for venues to book. But in the world of narco-corridos, the event had the exact opposite effect. It did not ruin Chelino, it turned him into a living god. He was no longer just a musician singing poetic stories about dangerous outlaws. He was a real-world outlaw who had stood face-to-face with an assassin on a public stage, drawn his own weapon, and fought for his life in a blaze of glory. He had lived the very violence that defined his art. His album sales skyrocketed, and his legendary status became completely untouchable. Tragically, this intense fame also painted an even larger target on his back, setting off the final countdown toward his ultimate assassination in Sinaloa just 4 months later. The Coachella shootout remains a terrifying, definitive moment where the illusion of entertainment shattered, exposing the deadly reality behind the music. In the study of aviation disasters, investigators often look at mechanical failures, severe weather, or structural defects to explain why a tragedy occurred. But occasionally, a catastrophe happens in perfect conditions, driven entirely by human miscommunication and visual illusion. The mid-air collision involving Pacific Southwest Airlines PSA Flight 182 over San Diego on the 25th of September 1978 is one such event. While the radar tracks and flight paths tell the technical story of how a Boeing 727 and a tiny Cessna 172 collided, the true, heartbreaking reality of the disaster is preserved inside the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, the black box that captured the final words, decisions, and emotions of the crew and passengers. To understand the atmosphere inside the cockpit before the chaos, one must realize how comfortable the crew felt. Captain James McFerrin and First Officer Robert Fox flew this regional route frequently. The morning was exceptionally clear, and because they were flying under Visual Flight Rules, VFR, they felt entirely in control. They were laughing, chatting with off-duty PSA employees who were hitching a ride in the cockpit's extra jump seats, and preparing for a routine landing at Lindbergh Field. The first shift in atmosphere occurred when air traffic control warned them about a small Cessna in their vicinity. First Officer Fox spotted a plane, reported it, and the crew went back to their landing checklists. What they did not know was that they had spotted the wrong aircraft. The real Cessna 172, flown by a student pilot and his instructor, was climbing directly ahead of them, moving much slower than the commercial jet. Because the Boeing 727 was descending with its nose pitched upward, the Cessna completely disappeared into a blind spot beneath the cockpit floor. As the jet closed the distance from behind, a subtle anxiety began to ripple through the cockpit. The crew couldn't see the Cessna anymore. The black box recorded the pilots trying to reassure themselves. "I think he's passed off to our right," Captain McFerrin muttered, searching the blue sky. "Yeah," First Officer Fox responded, though his voice lacked conviction. A few seconds later, a voice from one of the off-duty employees in the jump seat quietly noted the danger of the busy airspace, stating, "There's a lot of traffic out there. It's a busy place," the captain agreed. The tension was low, but the uncertainty was there. They assumed the plane was gone, but they didn't know. Instead of double-checking with radar controllers, they pressed forward. That silent gap in certainty proved fatal. At exactly 9:47 a.m., a violent, deafening crunch reverberated through the aircraft. The belly of the Boeing 727 slammed over the top of the Cessna at 2,600 feet. The impact was catastrophic. The small plane disintegrated, tearing open the structural framework of the Boeing's right wing and severing all internal hydraulic lines. Instantly, the entire atmosphere inside the cockpit shattered. The relaxed, professional environment vanished, replaced by an absolute cacophony of emergency alarms. The master caution lights flashed red, and the mechanical stick shaker began to violently vibrate the pilot's control wheels, warning them that the aircraft was losing aerodynamic lift. Because the hydraulic fluid was spraying out into the open air, the controls went completely slack. The giant airliner rolled heavily to the right and pitched forward into a terrifying, near-vertical dive toward a residential neighborhood below. In those final 30 seconds, as gravity pulled everything forward and the wind roared outside the cracked structure, the flight crew demonstrated incredible psychological resilience. There was no screaming, no wild panic, and no breakdown of order. Captain McFerrin and First Officer Fox fought with all their physical strength to pull back on the control columns, desperately trying to get the nose of the plane up. "What have we got here?" Fox asked, his muscles straining against the unresponsive controls. "We're hit, man. We're hit," McFerrin responded, his voice remarkably focused. Realizing the aircraft was completely unresponsive, McFerrin kept his finger on the radio trigger. He did not want the world to wonder what had happened. He keyed his microphone to inform the control tower of their fate. "Tower, we're going down. This is PSA," he reported calmly. Inside the main cabin, the 128 passengers were suddenly thrown into a living nightmare. The plane was diving at an angle so steep that the windows showed nothing but the roofs of houses and streets, rushing up at over 300 miles per hour. The immense G-forces made it difficult to move. Luggage tore free from overhead bins, and the cabin was filled with the terrifying sound of rushing air and the roar of the burning right wing. Yet, even in the face of certain death, the human spirit looked for connection. In those final 15 seconds, passengers clung to the hands of strangers or loved ones sitting next to them. Some began to pray silently, while others tried to comfort terrified children. Back in the cockpit, the flight engineer struggled to manage the failing engines. The captain, looking through the front windshield, saw the residential streets of North Park zooming closer. He knew there was nothing left to do. The mechanical struggle was over, and only the human moment remained. Trying to bring a shred of comfort to his dying crew and the machine they loved, Captain McFerrin muttered his final famous words to the airplane. "Easy, baby." It was a phrase used by veteran pilots to gently coax an aircraft out of a rough maneuver, a final, tragic sign of affection for the grinning bird that was about to die. Just 3 seconds before the impact, as the shadows of houses engulfed the cockpit windows, the CVR captured one final heartbreaking sound from the cabin area. An unknown voice, perhaps an off-duty pilot or a flight attendant opening the cockpit door, shouted a final message into the void. "I love you, Mom." At 9:07 a.m., the Boeing 727 slammed directly into the intersection of Dwight and Niles streets. The kinetic energy of the 300 mph impact completely pulverized the aircraft, creating a massive explosion that shook the entire city of San Diego. All 144 lives were extinguished in a fraction of a second. The physical wreckage was cleared away long ago, but the audio recording of those final 30 seconds remains a permanently chilling monument to the tragedy, a deeply moving record of professional bravery, tragic resignation, and the enduring power of human love at the literal edge of existence. The human body is an extraordinary, resilient machine, equipped with sophisticated survival mechanisms that have evolved over millions of years. When faced with an immediate life-threatening danger, our brain triggers an instantaneous command known as the fight-or-flight response. Adrenaline floods the bloodstream, the pupils dilate to take in more light, breathing quickens to oxygenate the muscles, and the heart pumps violently to prepare the body to either battle the threat or run away from it. It is an evolutionary masterpiece designed to keep us alive. However, like any high-powered system, there is a breaking point. When the mind is subjected to a level of pure, absolute terror that it cannot comprehend or escape, that very same survival mechanism can backfire, transforming our biological defenses into a fatal weapon. This profound and terrifying psychological phenomenon is at the absolute core of Yenia Gomez's tragedy on the abandoned railway bridge in Amaga, Colombia. To fully comprehend the horror of her final moments, one must look beyond the physical sequence of events and examine the sheer, devastating power of human fear. Yenia was a young analytical lawyer whose mind was trained to seek order, logic, and predictability. Yet, she carried a severe, debilitating phobia of heights. A phobia is not just a rational dislike, it is an intense, irrational dread that paralyzes the nervous system. When Yenia agreed to accompany her boyfriend bungee jumping in July of 2021, she was attempting an act of extreme psychological exposure. She wanted to confront her monster head-on. But a phobia cannot be reasoned with, and the environment at the bridge shattered her mental defenses before she ever stepped onto the platform. The multi-hour delay on the crowded bridge acted as a slow drip poison to her nervous system. As she stood over the massive chasm watching others drop into the abyss, her body was already locked in an uncontrollable panic attack. Her heart was racing at maximum capacity for hours, depleting her body's natural reserves of calm. By the time her name was called, Yenia was no longer operating on logic. She was experiencing severe tunnel vision and auditory exclusion, a psychological state where the brain, overwhelmed by terror, shuts down peripheral awareness. The roaring wind, the visual depth of the gorge, and the chaotic sounds of the crowd blurred into a single, terrifying sensory overload. Her mind was screaming for an escape, desperate to get the ordeal over with. When the instructor shouted, "Okay, jump!" a command meant solely for her fully secured boyfriend. Yenia's hyper-focused, panic-stricken brain registered only one thing. It was time to leap into the void to make the terror stop. She stepped off the wooden ledge and launched herself into the open air. But the elastic bungee cord had not been attached to her body. She was falling completely unprotected. What happens to the human mind and body during a definitive, unprotected fall from hundreds of feet in the air? In aviation and extreme sports accidents, this interval is referred to as the descent phase, a brief, agonizing window of time where a conscious individual realizes with absolute certainty that they are going to die. For Yenia Gomez, this descent lasted only a matter of 4 to 5 seconds. But inside the theater of her mind, those few seconds stretched out into an eternity of pure, unadulterated horror. As she left the platform, Yenia expected to feel the familiar, reassuring tug of the heavy harness tightening around her chest or ankles. She expected the violent, elastic recoil of the bungee rope to snap her safely back upward toward the sky. Instead, there was only the weightless, frictionless sensation of a terminal freefall. The wind roared past her ears, and the green jungle canopy and jagged rocks of the riverbed zoomed toward her at an accelerating pace of nearly 100 miles per hour. In that precise fraction of a second, the illusion of safety vanished. Yenia's conscious mind registered the ultimate horror. There was no cord. She was completely detached from the bridge, falling helplessly to her death. The physiological response to this realization was immediate and catastrophic. Pathologists and forensic scientists who study sudden death from fear note that when a person realizes they are in a completely inescapable fatal situation, the brain's amygdala sends a massive, unprecedented panic signal to the adrenal glands. The body releases a colossal, toxic surge of adrenaline and catecholamines, stress hormones, directly into the cardiovascular system. This massive chemical tidal wave hits the heart like a physical blow. The sudden influx of adrenaline forces the heart muscle to contract so violently and rapidly that it can no longer pump blood efficiently. The heart enters a chaotic, lethal rhythm known as ventricular fibrillation. the muscular walls of the heart begin to quiver helplessly instead of beating, causing blood pressure to instantly drop to zero. The brain is starved of oxygen, and consciousness fades. When the forensic team performed the official autopsy on Yenya's body, they expected to find that her death was caused by the massive deceleration trauma of impacting the rocky ground at the bottom of the gorge. Instead, the medical examiners made a startling and deeply haunting discovery. Her lungs and internal cardiovascular structures showed definitive signs that her heart had completely failed prior to impact. The profound, overwhelming terror of her realization had physically broken her heart while she was still suspended in midair. Her mind had processed a level of fear so immense that the body chose to shut down completely rather than endure the final impact. The story of Yenya Gomez is frequently cited as a tragic cautionary tale regarding industrial negligence and safety communication. But on a deeper, more profound level, it serves as an incredibly dark and thought-provoking study of the limits of human endurance. It proves that our emotions are not merely abstract thoughts. They are powerful, tangible forces that dictate our physical reality. Yenya did not die from the gravity of the earth, nor did she die from the stone below. She was killed by the sheer weight of her own realization, leaving behind a haunting legacy that reminds us that sometimes the ultimate limits of human fear can be just as lethal as a physical blow. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.
On the far northern tip of Maine, right where the state touches the Canadian border, there's a small rural town called Van Buren. It's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody. The population hovers around 2,000 people, and most of them have lived in Maine their entire lives. These are rugged, competent folks used to harsh winters and a quiet way of life. Unless you have a reason to be in Van Buren, like visiting family or passing through, you've probably never heard of it. It's not a place that makes headlines. But that all changed in 2019. The town found itself in the international spotlight, and it was all because of one man, a man named Ronald Sear. Ronald's story begins long before that, back in the 1950s. As a young man, he did what many of his generation did. He joined the Air Force and he served his country during the Korean War. When his time in the military was over, he didn't look for a new life in some big city. He came straight back home to Van Buren, Maine. He settled into a modest 2-story house near the center of town. For a little while, he just kind of floated. He didn't have a specific direction or a clear career path, but Ronald was always good with his hands. He loved building things, tinkering, figuring out how things worked. This natural skill and passion eventually led him to start his own business. It was a small but successful company selling tools, and he ran it right out of the shed on his property. It was his domain, his workshop, and his livelihood, all in one. Fast forward to 2019, Ronald Sear was now 65 years old. He was still living in that same house near town, but now he was living alone. And he was still running his tool-selling business from his shed. For Ronald, this life was enough. He was content. He had his routine, his work, his independence. He was happy. But that year, a crisis began to unfold. A small crack in his peaceful existence that would widen until it consumed everything. It started on a bright, sunny summer morning. Ronald left his house, walked the familiar path across his yard to his shed, and went inside. The moment he stepped through the door, he knew something was wrong. Inside the shed, Ronald kept a series of bins. These bins were filled with all the different tools he sold to his customers. He was in that shed every single day, either selling tools to a local contractor or just working on one of his own projects. Because of this, he had an almost photographic memory of his inventory. He knew exactly how full each of those bins should be. Anytime a bin started to get low, he would place an order for more stock. He was meticulous about it. He had been doing this for decades, and keeping his inventory full was second nature. So, on this particular morning, he walked in, and his eyes immediately went to a couple of the bins. They looked lower than he remembered. They were definitely not as full as they should have been. His first thought was simple. He must have made a mistake. Did I forget to order more supplies? Did I just let the stock run down without noticing? But the idea didn't sit right with him. He thought to himself, no, that's not possible. I am always on top of my inventory. It's the core of my business. It has to be something else. Maybe I took some tools into the house for a repair and just left them on the kitchen counter. Or maybe they're in the back of my truck. He was sure there was a perfectly logical explanation. So Ronald left the shed and began to search his property. He checked his house from top to bottom. He went through his truck, looking under the seats, in the glove compartment. But the missing tools were nowhere to be found. Now a little more concerned, he started making phone calls. He called his family members. He called the few close friends he had. He asked each of them the same question. Did you happen to come by and borrow some tools from the shed? Do you know anything about this? But every single person he spoke to gave him the same answer. No, Ronald, I have no idea what you're talking about. By the afternoon, Ronald found himself back inside his shed, standing among his bins, a feeling of unease settling deep in his stomach. He looked around, and only one explanation remained in his mind. Have I been robbed? It seemed impossible in a town like Van Buren, but what else could it be? He drove down to the local police station and explained what had happened. He told the officers about his business, his meticulous inventory, and the tools that had vanished without a trace. But the police reaction was not what he had hoped for. They were polite but dismissive. They basically suggested that he, a man who had run this business for decades, had simply miscounted. They told him the tools were probably still on his property somewhere, that he just misplaced them, and they were bound to turn up. An officer told him, look, Ronald, go back and do a really thorough search of your property. I'm sure they're there. And if you find some actual proof that someone stole from you, like a broken lock or a witness, then you can come back to us. Ronald left the station feeling completely annoyed and invalidated. He wanted them to take this seriously. He knew his property, he knew his inventory, and he knew something was wrong, but he could tell they weren't going to do anything. He drove back home, his mind racing. He went inside, sat down at his computer, and started researching. He typed in phrases like how to protect your home from theft and DIY home security. He scrolled through forums and articles looking for what other homeowners did when they felt vulnerable. That's when he came across an idea that he really liked. Tripwires. The concept was simple. You take a thin, strong wire and you stretch it taut, very low to the ground, all around the perimeter of your property. You anchor it on both sides. Then, along the wire, you hang little bells. In theory, an intruder walking onto your property in the dark wouldn't see the wire. They would kick it, the wire would shake, and the bells would ring, alerting the homeowner that someone was there. Ronald thought it was a brilliant, old-school solution. He went out and bought the supplies he needed. He spent the rest of the day carefully setting up these tripwires all around his property, making sure they were hidden but effective. He felt a sense of relief, a feeling that he was taking back control. But over the next several days, the tripwires remained silent. None of the bells ever rang. And yet, more tools continued to go missing from his shed. This was happening even though he was now making sure to lock the shed every single night. Ronald's anxiety grew. He started thinking, whoever is doing this, they're watching me. They must have seen me set up the tripwires. They know where they are, and they're stepping right over them. They must be sneaking into the shed during the day at the exact moment I have the doors unlocked for a customer, or when I step into the house for a moment. This isn't just some kid. This is a professional thief. As Ronald obsessed over this idea of a master thief who was targeting him, a new and much deeper fear began to take hold. If he couldn't stop this person from getting into his locked shed, from outsmarting his tripwires, then how could he possibly protect himself? How could he stop them from breaking into his house? Inside his home were all of his other valuables, his cash, things that couldn't be replaced. The thought terrified him. He felt exposed, a target in his own home. He decided he had no choice but to escalate his defenses. He had to turn his home into a fortress. He went back to his computer and began Googling more extreme ways to protect a property. After discovering a number of highly effective and highly dangerous techniques, he got to work. He began building a series of complex home defense systems. He was a skilled handyman, and he put all of his knowledge and effort into this project. He set up these various systems all around his property, both inside and outside his house. And after all of his new do-it-yourself security measures were in place, something remarkable happened. The theft of his tools stopped completely. In Ronald's mind, this was all the validation he needed. His defense system had worked. He had successfully outsmarted the thief and protected his home. But this victory would not be the end of his troubles. It was only the beginning of the end. Fast forward to Thanksgiving of that year, November 28th, the Van Buren Police Department received a frantic phone call. The man on the other end of the line was Ronald Sear. He was completely hysterical, his words tumbling out in a panic. He wasn't making much sense. The dispatcher tried to calm him down, tried to understand what was going on, but all they could get from Ronald was a desperate plea for police to come to his house immediately. The police hung up and immediately dispatched a car. They remembered Ronald from the summer. They knew he had been dealing with a potential thief. Their immediate thought was that maybe he had finally caught the person red-handed. Maybe there was a confrontation, a fight happening at his house right now. The police raced over to Ronald's house, their sirens silent so as not to spook a potential suspect. They pulled into his driveway, and at first glance, everything looked normal. Ronald's truck was parked where it always was. There were no obvious signs of a struggle or a disturbance. But then they noticed something unsettling. The front door to Ronald's house was wide open. The officers parked their cars, got out, and ran up onto the front porch. They stood in front of the open doorway and looked down. On the floor, there was a very obvious trail of blood. It started right there at the entrance and led straight back down a hallway, which then looped around to the left and disappeared from sight. Right away, the officers started yelling into the house. "Ronald? Ronald, are you okay? What's going on?" From deep inside the house, they heard a sound. It was a guttural, pained noise, and it sounded like it came from Ronald. This immediately confirmed their fears. Ronald had been hurt, and he was likely the one who had left the blood trail. The police drew their weapons and cautiously entered the house. They had no idea what they were walking into. They didn't know if an intruder was still inside, armed, and waiting for them. They moved slowly down the hall, their eyes scanning every corner, following the grim trail of blood. They rounded the corner where the hallway turned, and at the end of the trail, they found him. Ronald was sitting on the floor in his kitchen, his back slumped against some cabinets. He was clutching his midsection with both hands. He was covered in blood, and his face was completely pale. The officers immediately called for backup and for an ambulance. Then, as a security measure, one officer stayed with Ronald, while the other quickly cleared the rest of the first floor, making sure there was no one else in the house. The first floor was empty. They went upstairs, peeking into the rooms. The second floor was empty too. They rushed back down to Ronald, who was still just sitting there, barely conscious. They began administering first aid, trying to apply pressure to his wound. They tried to get him to explain what had happened, to tell them who did this to him. But Ronald was clearly in shock. He was in a daze, his eyes unfocused. He wasn't making any sense. Just a couple of minutes later, paramedics arrived. But by the time they got to him, Ronald had slipped into unconsciousness. As Ronald was being wheeled out of the house on a stretcher, the responding officers and the backup who had now arrived decided to do a more thorough search of the house. They needed to find some clue, any clue, as to what had happened here. They started in the kitchen where they had found him, looking for a weapon, a sign of a struggle, anything that stood out. But there was nothing. They moved from the kitchen towards the living room at the front of the house. As they walked into the living room, one of the officers suddenly screamed at the top of his lungs, "Stop! Everybody stop where you are! Don't move!" It turns out Ronald, as part of his very beefed up home security system, had installed various booby traps all around his property. This included inside of his house, and some of these traps were gun booby traps. The officer who had yelled for everyone to stop had just spotted one of them. He was looking up and saw a handgun anchored securely to the ceiling, aimed directly at the front door. A thin string was attached to the gun's trigger. That same string was then stretched across the room and attached to the doorknob of the front door. The mechanism was horribly simple. If this trap was active and a person opened the front door from the outside, the movement of the door would pull the string, which would pull the trigger, causing the gun to shoot whoever was standing in the doorway. It was a deadly, homemade security device. Clearly, Ronald had accidentally left this particular booby trap armed. When he had come home or opened his own front door for some reason, he had accidentally activated it, shooting himself in the stomach. After the officer pointed out the gun on the ceiling, everyone else started looking up. They began scanning the doorways and ceilings, and with a growing sense of horror, they realized there were other traps. In other doorways, just from where they were standing, they could see the barrels of more guns pointing down, clearly part of similar booby traps. In their haste to get inside and find Ronald, they had run right past them, completely oblivious to the danger they were in. It was a miracle that none of the other traps had been set off. Ronald was rushed to the hospital that night, but his wound was too severe. He passed away from his injury. His death was officially ruled an accident. And to this day, no one knows for sure if he really was dealing with a professional thief who was systematically stealing his tools, or if the thief was just a figment of his imagination, a product of loneliness and fear that drove him to turn his own home into a death trap. Mary Cerruti had a difficult childhood. Growing up in the 1950s and early 1960s in Houston, Texas, her family was always struggling. They barely had enough money to get by, and life was a constant challenge. Then, by the time Mary turned 21, a double tragedy struck. Both of her parents passed away, leaving her completely alone in the world with nothing to her name. After their deaths, Mary's life felt unanchored. She bounced around Houston, moving from one low-paying job to the next, just trying to stay afloat. Eventually, she met a man and fell madly in love. They got married, and for a while, it seemed like her life was finally turning around. But unfortunately, that marriage ended in divorce, leaving her heartbroken. After she managed to pick up the pieces, she met another man. Once again, she fell in love, and they too got married. It seemed like a second chance at happiness. But just like her first marriage, this one also ended in divorce. At this point, Mary was devastated by yet another heartbreak. She came to a quiet, sad conclusion. She decided that marriage just wasn't for her. She accepted that she probably wasn't going to have a family of her own. But she didn't let this realization crush her. Instead, she did something remarkable. She embraced her life as a loner. She found a new kind of contentment in her own company. Fast forward to the year 2015. Mary was now 61 years old, and she was still living alone. She lived in a small home in a Houston neighborhood that was rapidly changing. Over the past several decades, the area had begun to grow and gentrify. New modern apartment complexes were being built all the time, swallowing up the older, smaller houses. In fact, one of the apartment developers had approached Mary directly. They offered to buy her house so they could tear it down and build over her land. But Mary refused. It didn't matter how much money they offered her. She loved her little house, and she had no intention of selling it. So her house became an island, the only single-family home left on a long stretch of land, now dominated by large apartment buildings. Mary kind of liked it that way. In her diary, she wrote that her little bungalow was like her castle, and all the towering apartment buildings around her were her castle walls. Mary didn't have much contact with other people. She didn't have a consistent job, so she didn't have relationships with coworkers. She had some living family, but she had very little, if any, contact with them. And she didn't really have any friends. There was one exception, a woman who owned an arts and crafts shop in town. Mary would periodically go into town and visit the shop just to say hello and have a brief conversation. But despite all of this, Mary was not lonely. She had lots and lots of cats. She absolutely loved cats. Anytime she saw a stray cat wandering through her neighborhood, Mary would put out food and water for it. She would patiently try to coax the cat to come closer, to come into her house, and when it finally did, she would work to win the cat's trust. Once she did, she would give it a permanent place to live. She would feed it and take care of it as if it were her own child. Before long, she had dozens of cats living in the house with her. These cats became her family. They were her best friends. And because of them, she rarely, if ever, left the house. She mostly just stayed inside with them in her own little world, content and surrounded by the creatures she loved. In February of that year, one of Mary's neighbors happened to be walking by her property. They glanced over at her house and saw a stack of mail had piled up on her front porch. It was a clear sign that Mary hadn't opened her front door to get her mail in several days. The neighbor also noticed that while Mary's yard did tend to get a little overgrown from time to time, it now looked exceptionally wild. The grass was high, the trees were untrimmed. It looked like no one was even trying to take care of it. A feeling of concern washed over the neighbor. Maybe something had happened to Mary. So, the neighbor opened the gate to her fence, walked across the unkempt yard, and went up onto the porch. They knocked firmly on the front door, but there was only silence from inside. The neighbor leaned over and tried to peer through the window that was just to the left of the door, hoping to see something, anything. But there was a curtain drawn across the window, blocking the view. The neighbor tried knocking on the door one more time, louder this time, but again, they were met with total silence. After standing there for another minute, unsure what to do, the neighbor left the front porch and walked around to the side of the house. They thought maybe they could look in one of the side windows, but when they got there, those windows were covered with curtains too. The neighbor walked back to the front of the property and just stood there on the sidewalk, looking at the quiet, still house. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something was wrong. Someone needed to make sure Mary was really okay. Someone needed to get inside that house. So, the neighbor pulled out their phone and called the Houston police, explaining the situation and their concerns. A few minutes later, a police car arrived. The officers walked right up onto Mary's porch, just as the neighbor had done. They knocked on her door. Silence. After that, the police talked to another neighbor who surprisingly had a spare key that Mary had given them a long time ago for emergencies. The police took the key and went back to Mary's front door. They put the key in the lock, turned it, and the door clicked open. The moment they pushed the door open, they were hit with a horrible, overwhelming smell coming from inside the house. The police pushed the door the rest of the way open and cautiously stepped inside. They yelled out Mary's name, but it was silent. Then, before the police even began to walk around and look for her, they looked off to their left and to their right, and they saw a truly tragic sight. There were dead cats all over the ground, in every room they could see from the doorway. The Houston police had seen situations like this before. They knew the likely scenario. Someone who lives alone with no one regularly checking on them passes away unexpectedly. And when they die, all of their pets are trapped inside the house. With no one to feed them or give them water, they eventually pass away too. So at this point, the police were fully expecting to find Mary's body somewhere in the house. They began to walk through the home, room by room, searching for her. But after searching the entire house from top to bottom, checking every closet, every corner, they could not find Mary anywhere. Confused, the police left Mary's house. By now, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered outside, drawn by the police cars. The officers spoke to a couple of the neighbors and asked them what they knew. Did she say anything about going somewhere? Did you see her leave at any point? The consensus among everyone they spoke to was the same. Mary kept to herself. She didn't travel. She never went anywhere. She just stayed in her house with her cats. It was very unlikely that she would have just abandoned her home, and especially abandoned her cats, because she loved them so much. The police were now completely baffled. She had to be in the house somewhere. So they called for a few more officers to come to the property. The whole group went back inside Mary's house and conducted a second, much more thorough search. They really looked for Mary this time, thinking that maybe she had collapsed in a closet and her body was hidden behind some clothes, or that she was somehow concealed somewhere in the house. They really tore the place apart, looking for her. But again, there was just nothing. She was gone. After they finally stopped the search without finding Mary, the police managed to track down and contact some of Mary's extended family. They asked them the same question. Did Mary say anything about taking a trip? Is there any reason she would just abandon her property? But her family all said the same thing. We don't really talk to Mary. We don't know where she went. We have absolutely no idea. For a little while, the Houston police continued to search for Mary in and around the city, but they found no leads, no trace of her at all. Eventually, the search wound down, and her case went cold. They reached out to Mary's family one last time and told them, if you hear anything at all about what happened to Mary, please let us know. Several months later, with no one making the mortgage payments, Mary's house went into foreclosure. The bank put the house up for auction, and a real estate entrepreneur in Houston bought it quickly. He had the house cleaned out, made some minor repairs, and then put it on the market to be rented out. For the next couple of years, several different tenants lived in Mary's old house. None of them ever stayed for very long. Then, in March of 2017, the property was vacant again. A young couple reached out to the landlord. They said they were looking to rent and were hoping to potentially stay in this property for 2 or 3 years. The landlord was thrilled to have long-term tenants. He sent over a lease, they signed it, and the property was theirs. Once the couple had officially rented the house, the husband decided to go over on his own. He wanted to walk around the property and get a sense of the space to see what they would need to buy in terms of furniture. So, the husband arrived at the property. He went in the front door, walked around the first floor, and then at some point he decided he wanted to go up into the attic to see how much storage space they had. He found the trapdoor in the ceiling of a hallway. He grabbed the string that was hanging down and he pulled it, revealing a folded up ladder. He flipped down the lower piece of the ladder, set it on the ground, and then began to climb up. Once his head was in the attic, he stayed on the ladder for a moment, just scanning the space. He saw that there really wasn't much up there. There were a couple of old metal cages that looked like they might have been for pets, but mostly it was just dirty and dark. It was clear that no one had really come up here in a long time. He assumed that the other tenants just hadn't used it for storage. The husband was about to go back down the ladder when he noticed something odd. Off to the right side of the attic, kind of far away from the ladder, right where the roof began to pitch down towards the floor, he saw that one of the floorboards was popped up. It didn't look right. He stared at it, looking around at the rest of the attic floor. All the other floorboards were perfectly flat and uniform, but that one was really jacked up, sticking out at an angle. He was curious. So he climbed the rest of the way up into the attic, stooped down to avoid the low ceiling, and walked over to this loose floorboard. When he was standing over it, he could see that the board had come loose from a hole in the floor that it was supposed to be covering. The hole itself was completely dark. He pulled out his phone, turned on the flashlight, and aimed the beam of light straight down into the hole. This hole wasn't a crawl space. It was basically just a gap, a void between two of the interior walls on the first floor. And as he shined his light down into that dark, narrow gap, he saw them. At the bottom were the skeletal remains of the woman the Houston police had been looking for the past 2 years, Mary Cerruti. While no one can know for sure exactly what happened to her, it's believed that back in early 2015, around the time she went missing, she had gone up into her attic. Perhaps her cats liked to go up there to sunbathe. On that side of the attic, there was a large window that let in a lot of light. So maybe she went up there to feed them or just to check on them. As she walked over to that side of the attic, she must have stepped on that one loose floorboard. It gave out from under her weight, and she fell through it like a trapdoor. She would have fallen down into that narrow gap between the walls. It's unlikely she was seriously hurt from the fall itself. But when she stood back up again in that tight, dark space, she would have realized very quickly the horror of her situation. There was nowhere for her to go. She couldn't go left or right, and she couldn't get back up into the attic. The opening was too far above her for her to reach. And there was no way for her to use the walls to climb back up because the space she was in was so narrow she could barely even move. She also didn't have a cell phone on her, so she couldn't call for help. And even if she screamed, no one would have heard her. She was behind several layers of walls and insulation. And because no one ever checked on her, there was no one who was going to notice she was missing and come looking for her. She was totally, completely on her own. Trapped in that little space inside her own home, Mary likely spent her last couple of days screaming and desperately trying to find a way out. But nothing worked. And eventually, she passed away. And then, tragically, all of her beloved cats trapped inside the house without her did too. Her death was ruled an accident. In the spring of 2017, Antonio Navarrete was on top of the world. Just a year earlier, the 21-year-old Florida resident had met the love of his life, a young woman named Daisy Martinez. And now, Daisy was pregnant. They were both incredibly excited about starting a family together. For the time being, Antonio and Daisy were living with Antonio's parents in his hometown of Wimauma, a quiet, rural suburb just south of Tampa. But Antonio had a bright future ahead of him. Ever since he had graduated from high school, he knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. He wanted to be an auto mechanic. And he had the skills for it. From the time he was a toddler, he had been obsessed with cars. He would break apart his toy cars and then patiently put them back together again, figuring out how every little piece worked. As he got a little older, he started drawing these very intricate, detailed pictures of cars that he loved or his own designs for new cars. Then, when he was a teenager, he began tinkering with real cars until he finally saved up enough money to get a car of his own. It was a white Chevy lowrider pickup truck, and it was his pride and joy. He tricked it out with all these fancy lights, special rims, and a huge sound system that took up most of his back seat. He even gave it a nickname, Casper. It was thanks in part to this truck that Antonio, who was usually too shy to be much of a ladies' man, met Daisy in the first place. Antonio had driven Casper to a local car meetup. It was an event for other car enthusiasts where you could park your vehicle and walk around to see what other people had done to upgrade or enhance their own cars. While Antonio was there, walking around and admiring the other vehicles, he saw her. On the far side of the meetup, there was this unbelievably beautiful young woman. He found himself just staring at her. He couldn't help it. And this young woman, who was Daisy, eventually looked up, caught his eye, and she smiled at him. And the rest, as they say, was history. 6 months later, not long after Daisy had moved in with Antonio at his parents' house, the couple announced to their delighted families that they were going to have a baby. And then Antonio got yet another piece of good news. He had landed a good job with a company that did maintenance work for Tampa Electric Company's Big Bend power plant. The plant was located in Apollo Beach, Florida, which was about 10 miles to the east of his parents' home. Now, this was not Antonio's dream job. He still very much wanted to become an auto mechanic one day. But this job paid $12 an hour, which was nearly double what he was used to making. With this job, he and Daisy would finally be able to save up enough money to get a place of their own, hopefully before the baby arrived that fall. Also, Antonio had been told by other people who worked for the company that this was actually a really easy job. He'd heard that pretty much all you did was roll around on golf carts all day, picking up trash. It sounded perfect. A few weeks later, on June 24th, Antonio found himself driving in his truck, Casper, to the Big Bend power plant for his first day on the job. As he drove, he would have glanced over at the picture of Daisy he had taped to his dashboard. She was the only woman he had ever loved besides his mother. When Antonio arrived at the Big Bend power plant, he was totally amazed at just how enormous the place was. It was basically a huge factory that sat right up against the water. There were 4 huge smokestacks coming out of the ceiling of the factory with thick white smoke billowing out of them. This plant produced electricity by burning coal. This process was done in 4 distinct units inside the factory. Each of these units was comprised of a humongous boiler, which is basically a 12-story tall oven. Here's how it worked. Coal is loaded into this huge boiler, and it burns at the bottom. This creates steam. That steam travels up the boiler and begins to turn these huge turbines, and that's what creates the electricity. The steam then just continues up the boiler and out its respective smokestack into the air. In newer, more modern power plants, the airborne ash, which is a natural byproduct of burning coal, is captured inside of the boiler. But at Big Bend, 3 of their 4 units were built back in the 1970s. They were older models, and they did not have a system to capture the airborne ash inside the boilers. Instead, the ash would get heated up so much that it would melt and turn into a substance called slag. Slag is basically molten lava, the same kind of stuff that comes out of volcanoes. As this slag built up inside the boiler, it was designed to drain through a man-sized hole at the very bottom of the boiler. Right below that hole was a 30-foot tall water tank called a cooling tank. This red-hot slag would basically dump down into that water, which would cool it off instantly, turning it into these kind of glassy, hard rocks. These rocks would then settle at the bottom of the 30-foot cooling tank. At the very bottom of the tank was a grinding mechanism. This grinder would pull these hardened, cooled-off little boulders of slag into it, crush them up, and then spit them out on the other side as little tiny bits of slag chips. These chips would then get sold for use in everything from sandpaper to roofing shingles. So, after Antonio had spent several minutes just admiring this gargantuan building he would be working in, he gathered up his things, hopped out of his truck, and headed toward the front doors. That day, and the next couple of days, were very uneventful for him. He basically just sat in a break room and watched videos about safety procedures and training. When he wasn't doing that, he was out trying to navigate his way around the inside of this huge factory, which was like a giant maze. He found out very quickly that it was a very hazardous place to work. There were huge trucks moving around inside of it, it was super loud, and there was just heavy machinery operating constantly all around you. But after several days of just walking around and asking people what things were, Antonio felt like he had a pretty good handle on the layout of the plant and also on what his job would actually entail. On Thursday, June 29th, just 4 days into his new job, Antonio woke up in his parents' house in a really good mood. The next day, Friday, Daisy was going in for an ultrasound. They were finally going to find out whether their baby was a boy or a girl, and he was incredibly excited about it. So Antonio came downstairs, grabbed a quick bite to eat, and then he kissed Daisy on the cheek. He headed outside, got into his truck, and began the commute to work. A few hours later, Antonio's mother was in the grocery store. She pulled her phone out of her purse, and she noticed she had a missed call from Antonio. He had left a voicemail. So she played the voicemail and put the phone to her ear. And what she heard was quite possibly the most traumatic thing a mother could ever hear from their child. After leaving the house that morning, Antonio drove all the way to work without any issues. He parked in the lot, he went inside the building, and initially, the day was just like any other day. He just kind of drove around the facility in a golf cart and picked up trash. That was it. But just a couple of hours into his shift, two fairly significant issues arose at the exact same time, both of them inside of Unit 2. In the boiler, the molten slag that was building up had somehow created a sort of plug over that man-sized hole where the slag was supposed to dump down into the water chamber. So, as more and more slag was being created as the ash melted, it wasn't draining into the chamber. All of this molten slag was just building up on top of itself inside the boiler. At the same time, down in the water chamber, in a completely unconnected issue, the slag that had previously fallen into the water, cooled and settled at the bottom, had landed in such a way that it had actually blocked the grinding mechanism. So, none of the cooled slag boulders and rocks were being ground up and expelled out the other side. They needed to fix these two issues quickly, otherwise Unit 2 would become basically ineffective and would have to be shut down. Now, the safe way to fix these two blockages would be to start by turning off Unit 2's boiler completely. Then, once it was off and had time to cool, you could drop dynamite into the boiler itself to break up the blockage over the man-sized hole. And you could send a team of workers into the water chamber after you drained it to manually chip away and move the blockage over the grinding mechanism. However, turning a boiler off at a power plant is extremely expensive. It costs a huge amount of money in lost revenue. So, the Tampa Electric Company decided to do things differently. They decided to just have their workers fix these blockages without turning the boiler off. At 4 p.m, a senior plant manager rounded up 5 other employees, which included Antonio, to come with him and do these repairs inside of Unit 2. The plan was this. They would empty all the water from the cooling chamber of Unit 2. Then, once it was empty, they would open something called the doghouse door, which is a small access door on the outside of the cooling chamber towards the bottom. They would open that door up, giving them a direct line of sight into the bottom of this cooling chamber, right where the grinding mechanism was, where all those cooled slag rocks had piled up. They would then fire high-pressure water cannons into the bottom of this cooling chamber to try and dislodge these slag rocks off of the grinding mechanism. After they cleared that blockage, they would shut the doghouse door and then figure out how to deal with the blockage inside the boiler above. But that felt like a secondary issue. They needed to make sure the grinding mechanism was cleared before they did anything else. Now, you need to understand that this company had asked its employees to do this type of repair before, to do it with the boiler still on. And in the past, nothing bad had ever happened. So these 6 guys, including Antonio, must have thought this was just a totally routine procedure. They probably thought they would never be asked to do something like this if it was extremely hazardous. But it would turn out that what they were doing, making these repairs with the boiler still on, was quite possibly the most hazardous thing they could possibly do at that plant. Either way, the 6-man team made their way over to Unit 2. They began taking up positions with their water cannons right in front of the doghouse door. Antonio's job for this operation was actually not to be involved in getting the slag free. He was just there to clean up any mess during and after the operation. So he stood kind of in front of the doghouse door, but maybe 10 or 15 feet back from it, just standing and watching the other guys do their jobs. You need to understand the scale of the machinery in front of Antonio and these other men. You have the water chamber, which is 30 feet tall, and directly above the water chamber is the 12-story tall boiler that is still on. There is coal actively burning inside of it. There is red-hot slag, basically lava, just kind of tumbling around inside of it. And the steam inside of this boiler is well over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. These men were completely dwarfed by this totally dangerous piece of machinery. But eventually, their operation began. The senior plant manager had the water chamber drained. Then, after it was empty, they opened the doghouse door. Antonio watched as the other 5 men took turns with their water cannons, firing them through the small door at the big slag rocks that were sitting on top of the grinding mechanism. It wasn't really working that well, but they were starting to make some slow progress. Antonio was likely just kind of getting bored, waiting for this to be over, because there really wasn't much for him to do. There wasn't much cleanup happening yet. And then, as he was standing there, something horrible happened. Because the boiler had been left on, all that ash was still getting melted and turned into slag. And the slag was not being drained because that plug had formed over the man-sized hole in the boiler. So you have all this molten slag that's building up, getting heavier and heavier and heavier. And about 20 minutes into their cleanup operation, the immense weight of all that slag finally broke through the plug. Immediately, this created a massive opening where all this red-hot slag, this lava, came tumbling down. It fell into the empty cooling tank, rebounded off the back wall, and shot out of the open doghouse door like a tidal wave of hellfire. In seconds, thousands of gallons of this lava-like substance was all over all 6 men. It was like a wave of fire washing over them. And then, after the slag hit the ground, they were all standing in 6 inches of what was basically lava, a molten pool that stretched 40 feet in every direction. Now, unlike trying to run in mud or deep water where you're just moving slowly, every step you take in this slag, your foot basically melts into it. With every single step, your shoe melts, then your skin melts, then your bones melt into this substance. So all of these men, after immediately being hit with this stuff and literally catching on fire, likely tried to start running. But it was like their bodies were being slowly consumed by this slag feet first. Antonio tried to run, just like the rest of them, but he couldn't go anywhere. He fell onto the slag, he was laying on his side, and as he was literally melting and burning to death, he reached into his pants pocket with his free hand. He pulled his phone out, and he called his mother. She didn't pick up, and so he left her a voicemail. And all he said was, "Mom, I'm burning. Please call the cops. Please, Mom." And in the background of this voicemail, all you can hear is the horrible hissing sound of the steam and slag pouring out of the boiler. In total, 5 of the 6 men that were a part of this repair operation would be killed from this tidal wave of slag. Antonio would be one of them. Tampa Electric would end up paying out a settlement to each of the families of the deceased. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.
Have you ever had a dream that felt so real, so incredibly vivid, that when you woke up, you had to look around your room to make sure you were actually safe in your own bed? Most of the time, we wake up, shake it off, and move on. The dream fades away, and we never think about it again. But in September of 1885, a young woman named Mary had a dream that refused to fade away. Instead, it led her to a discovery that defied all logical explanation. It is a story that was printed in newspapers all around the world because of how truly unbelievable it was. But to understand how this happened, we have to look at where Mary was in her life at that exact moment. Mary was a young woman living in London. She was smart, kind, and had her whole life ahead of her. But she was also carrying a massive, heavy burden. Just 2 years earlier, her husband had died in a tragic accident. They had been deeply in love, and he was her absolute world. This sudden loss shattered Mary, sending her into a spiraling, deep depression. For 2 long years, she barely left her home in London. She went through the motions of everyday life, but she was just a shell of her former self, completely paralyzed by her grief. Mary's family and her husband's family watched her struggle, and they were incredibly worried. They did not want her to be alone. So they constantly sent her invitations to come visit them, hoping to get her out of London so she could find some peace. In September of 1885, Mary decided to accept one of these invitations. Her husband's aunt, who was very elderly and lived in a large country house in rural England, had asked Mary to stay with her. The aunt's house was about 100 miles away from London, which back then was a long, exhausting journey. Mary packed her suitcase, boarded a carriage, and began the trip. As the city faded behind her, replaced by open fields and rolling hills, Mary felt incredibly lonely. Every bump in the road reminded her of the empty space beside her where her husband should have been sitting. She spent the entire journey staring out of the window, lost in her thoughts, remembering the trips they used to take together. By the time the carriage finally pulled up to the estate, it was late in the evening and completely dark outside. Mary stepped out of the carriage onto the dirt road and stood there looking up at the silhouette of the massive country house. She walked up the stone steps, grabbed her suitcase, and knocked on the front door. A moment later, the door creaked open, and the aunt's maid greeted Mary with a warm smile. She took Mary's suitcase and told her she would carry it to the guest room so Mary could see her aunt right away. Mary thanked her and walked down the long, quiet hallway toward the bedroom. When she reached the room, she knocked gently, opened the door, and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit by a single candle, and lying in the bed was her husband's aunt. She was very old and frail in declining health. This was a big part of why Mary had agreed to make the journey. She knew her aunt did not have much time left. When the aunt saw Mary, she smiled warmly, and Mary sat down in a chair right next to the bed. For the first few minutes, they just engaged in normal small talk, catching up on the long journey and the quiet daily routine of the countryside. But as they talked, the aunt's smile faded, and she looked at Mary with pity. Mary immediately noticed it and felt a tight knot in her throat because she knew exactly what was coming. The aunt reached out, took Mary's hand, and asked her how she was really holding up. And just like that, the raw grief came rushing back, and Mary had to fight back her tears. She explained that she was trying, but it was just so hard to go on without him. The aunt, with the best of intentions, told Mary that she was still so young. She said that while it was natural to grieve, Mary had to eventually move on, find someone else, get married again, and start a new life. But to Mary, this was the last thing she wanted to hear. She believed her husband was the love of her life, and no one could replace him. She did not want to move on or find anyone else. She just wanted her husband back. But she did not want to argue. So she simply told her aunt that she was extremely tired from the travel and should go to bed. The aunt nodded, and they hugged. Mary left the room, walked to the guest room, changed into her nightgown, and crawled into bed. But a few hours later, in the dead of night, Mary's eyes flew open. She bolted upright, gasping for air. Her skin was cold and clammy, covered in sweat. She was shaking and completely disoriented. It took her several moments of staring at the unfamiliar walls to remember where she was. Once she calmed down, she realized she had just had the most terrifying, realistic nightmare she had ever experienced. In the dream, she was standing at the edge of a massive dark field. It was nighttime, and there was nothing around for miles. The sky was pitch black, with no stars and no moon. But right in the middle of this empty field, sitting all by itself, was a small, broken-down wooden shed. It looked incredibly old, with rotting planks and a door hanging off its hinges. In the dream, Mary felt an intense, overwhelming wave of fear looking at this shed. Every instinct told her to run. But she could not control her movements, and her feet began to carry her toward it. With every step she took toward the shed, her terror grew. And then, as she got closer, she started to hear a sound coming from inside. It was the sound of a woman moaning in absolute agony. The sound was so raw and painful that it made Mary's skin crawl. But still, she could not stop. She walked right up to the shed, reached out her hand, and flung the door open. Inside, tucked into the dark corner, was an emaciated, dirty woman who was clearly dying. But as the woman slowly turned her head to look at Mary, her face suddenly shifted. It was no longer a stranger's face. It was the face of Mary's dead husband, staring back at her with hollow, lifeless eyes. And that was the exact moment Mary had jolted awake. She sat in the dark room for a long time, trying to shake the image of her husband's face from her mind. Her heart was still racing, and she knew there was no way she could fall back asleep. She needed to clear her mind. So, she got out of bed, put on her shoes, and grabbed her heavy coat. She also grabbed a small silver flask of brandy from her suitcase, thinking a few sips of the strong alcohol might help soothe her frayed nerves. She quietly slipped out of the front door of the house and stepped into the cool night air. The English countryside was completely silent. It was so different from the constant, noisy bustle of London. There were no gas lamps, no carriages, and no people. The only light came from the bright moon hanging high in the sky, casting a silver glow over everything. Mary took a sip of her brandy and began to walk. At first, she planned to just walk around the ants' garden. But the cool air felt so good, and the silence was so peaceful that she just kept walking. She walked past the boundary of the property and out into the open countryside. She did not know where she was going, but she did not care. She just wanted to walk until she felt calm. About 15 minutes later, Mary found herself walking up a steep grassy hill. The moonlight was casting long, dramatic shadows across the landscape. She reached the top of the hill, took another sip of her brandy, and looked out at the view. And the moment she did, she froze in absolute terror. Spread out before her was a massive, empty field. And right in the middle of that field was a small, broken-down wooden shed. It was the exact same shed from her nightmare. The rotting wood, the crooked roof, the door hanging off its hinges. It was identical in every single way. Mary stood frozen, staring at the structure. Her mind was screaming at her to turn around and run back to the house. This was impossible. How could a place from her dream actually exist in real life, in a part of the country she had never visited before? It made no sense. But just like in her dream, she suddenly felt this powerful, unexplainable urge to go to the shed. It was as if some invisible force was pulling her down the hill, and her legs began to move on autopilot. She walked down the hill and stepped into the tall grass of the field. With every step, the air seemed to grow colder and her breathing became shallow. And then, when she was about 50 yards away from the shed, she heard it. It was the exact same sound from her nightmare. A weak, painful, moaning sound was coming from inside the wooden walls. Mary was absolutely terrified, convinced that if she opened that door, she was going to see her dead husband's face staring back at her. But she could not stop. She reached the door, took a deep breath, and threw it open. She looked into the dark corner of the shed, and there, huddled on the dirt floor, was indeed a figure. It was a woman, incredibly thin, covered in mud, and shivering violently. But when the woman slowly raised her head to look at Mary, she did not have the face of Mary's husband. She was a complete stranger, but she was clearly dying and needed immediate help. Mary felt a sudden rush of relief, but it was quickly replaced by deep concern. This woman was in a terrible state. She was wearing torn, dirty clothes, and her skin was pale and sunken. She looked like she had not eaten in weeks. She was so weak she could barely keep her eyes open, and she was groaning in pain. Mary knelt down next to the woman and asked her what had happened, but the woman was far too weak to answer. Mary knew this woman needed a doctor immediately. She looked around the empty field, but there was no one in sight. The nearest house was her aunt's, which was at least a 15-minute walk away, and Mary was not strong enough to carry her. But Mary also knew that if she left this woman alone in the freezing cold to go find help, she might not survive. So, Mary made a decision to stay with her. Mary took off her own heavy coat and gently wrapped it around the shivering woman's shoulders. Then, she opened her flask of brandy and slowly poured a few drops into the woman's mouth. The woman swallowed it and let out a soft sigh. For the rest of the night, Mary sat on the cold dirt floor of the shed, holding the stranger in her arms. She kept her as warm as she could, occasionally giving her small sips of brandy to keep her conscious. It was a long, exhausting night, but Mary refused to leave her side. Finally, the sky began to turn gray, and the sun started to rise over the hills. Mary looked down at the woman and was relieved to see she was still breathing. In fact, she actually seemed a little bit better. But they still needed to get out of there. Mary was just about to stand up and run to the house for help when she heard a sound in the distance. It was the distinct sound of wooden wheels and horse hooves on a nearby dirt road. Mary jumped up, ran out of the shed, and stood in the field, waving her arms. Coming down the road was a large, horse-drawn, covered wagon. Mary began to scream for help as loudly as she could, desperate to get the driver's attention. The driver of the wagon heard her, pulled on the reins, and brought the horse to a stop. He looked out from the driver's seat, surprised to see a young woman standing in the middle of a field at dawn, looking disheveled and frantic. Mary ran over to the wagon and quickly explained that there was a dying woman in the shed who needed urgent medical attention. The driver, seeing how desperate Mary was, immediately jumped down from his seat and followed her back to the shed. When he saw the state of the stranger, he didn't ask any questions. He gently picked her up, carried her out of the shed, and placed her in the back of his covered wagon. Mary climbed in after her, and the driver turned the wagon around and headed straight toward Mary's aunt's estate. When they arrived, the driver carried the unconscious woman into the house. Mary immediately told her aunt's maid to run to the village and fetch the local doctor. With the stranger now safe inside the house and the doctor on the way, Mary felt a sudden, massive wave of exhaustion hit her. She had been awake all night in the freezing cold, and she had used every ounce of her strength to save this woman. She felt incredibly weak. Mary decided she needed to lie down for just a few minutes while they waited for the doctor. She walked up to the guest room, climbed into bed, and closed her eyes. But as she lay there, she realized this was not just normal exhaustion. Her body began to ache, and her throat felt like it was on fire. Within hours, she developed a raging, intense fever. When the doctor finally arrived at the house, he ended up having to treat 2 patients instead of 1. The stranger was severely malnourished and dehydrated, but with food, warmth, and rest, she was expected to recover. Mary, however, was in a much worse state. The exposure to the cold night air, combined with the extreme physical and emotional stress she had been under, had triggered a severe, life-threatening illness. For the next several weeks, Mary remained bedridden. She was completely delirious, drifting in and out of consciousness. Her fever would spike to dangerous levels, and her aunt and the maid feared she would not survive. They took turns sitting by her bedside, bathing her forehead with cool water, and praying for her recovery. Mary had no concept of time, experiencing only a blur of fever dreams. It was not until the beginning of October, nearly a month later, that Mary's fever finally broke. One morning, she opened her eyes and felt a cool breeze coming through the open window. For the first time in weeks, her head was completely clear. The heavy, oppressive fog of the illness was gone. She slowly looked around the room, taking in her surroundings. And as she did, she noticed someone sitting in a chair in the corner of the room. At first, Mary assumed it was a nurse who had been hired to care for her. But as she squinted her eyes to get a better look, she realized she was looking at the woman from the shed. But she did not look like she was dying anymore. Her cheeks were full of color, her hair was clean, and she was wearing a clean dress. She looked healthy, vibrant, and incredibly happy. When she saw that Mary was awake and looking at her with clear, conscious eyes, the woman's face lit up with a massive, joyful smile. Mary was completely confused. She did not understand why this woman was still here in her aunt's house after all this time. Surely, she should have returned to her own family. Mary opened her mouth to ask her what was going on. Before Mary could get a single word out, the woman jumped up from her chair and rushed to the side of the bed. The woman was bursting with excitement. She told Mary that she had been waiting by her bedside for weeks, praying for the moment Mary would wake up because she had a story to tell her. She said she could not leave until she had told Mary everything, because Mary had not just saved her life, she had changed the course of history for her family. The woman sat down on the edge of the bed and began to speak. She explained that 2 years earlier, she had boarded a large passenger ship in England. The ship was bound for South America, specifically Brazil, where she was planning to start a new life. But about 5 days into the voyage, when they were far out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, a catastrophic fire broke out on board. The fire spread with terrifying speed. The crew and passengers panicked, and the ship quickly began to sink into the dark, freezing ocean. The woman said she had been asleep in her cabin when the fire started. By the time she woke up, the hallway outside her room was filled with thick, black smoke. She was trapped and convinced she would die. But then, just as she was about to give up hope, her cabin door was kicked open. A man, a complete stranger to her, came running through the smoke and fire. He did not know her, but he risked his own life to save her. He scooped her up in his arms, carried her up to the burning deck, and threw her into one of the very last lifeboats just as the ship began to go under. The stranger climbed into the lifeboat with her, along with a handful of other survivors. They had no food, very little water, and no way to navigate. They simply rowed through the dark ocean, hoping to find land. After days of rowing, they eventually spotted a small, uninhabited island. It was little more than a pile of rocks and sand in the middle of the ocean, but it was land. They dragged their lifeboat onto the shore and realized they were shipwrecked. For an entire year, this group of survivors lived on that deserted island. They had to forage for whatever they could find to eat, which was mostly wild plants, shellfish, and insects. It was a brutal, miserable existence. They were constantly hungry, sick, and exposed to the harsh elements. But through it all, the brave stranger continued to protect her. The stranger was the only reason she survived that year on the island. Finally, after 12 long months of misery, a passing ship spotted their signal fire. The survivors were rescued and brought back to England. But the trauma of the shipwreck and the year of survival had taken a devastating toll on the man who had saved her. He had developed a severe physical illness from eating toxic plants on the island, and the mental strain of the ordeal had caused him to completely lose his mind. He was no longer coherent. He could not speak, he did not know who he was, and he was completely unresponsive to the world around him. When they arrived back in England, because he had no identification and could not speak, the authorities simply placed him in a state-run hospital. Specifically, they put him in a ward for the mentally insane, where he was essentially locked away and forgotten about. The woman told Mary that she felt an overwhelming sense of guilt and debt to this man. He had saved her life twice, first from the fire and then on the island, and now he was locked away in an asylum with no one to care for him. She knew he must have a family somewhere who thought he was dead. She made it her life's mission to find them. She spent months searching for any clue about who this man was. She searched passenger manifests, and finally, she found a lead. She discovered that the man had an elderly aunt who lived in a large country house in rural England. The only problem was, the aunt's house was on the other side of the country, and the woman had spent every single penny she had on her search. But she refused to give up. She decided she would walk the entire distance. She set out on foot, traveling for days, begging for scraps of food along the way. But as she drew closer to her destination, her body began to fail her. She was starving, dehydrated, and exhausted. She realized she was not going to make it. Just as she felt her legs giving out, she saw a small, broken-down wooden shed in the middle of a field. She managed to crawl inside, collapsed onto the dirt floor, and prepared herself to die. She was devastated that she had come so close to her goal, only to fail the man who had saved her life. And that was when Mary had opened the door. Mary sat in her bed, listening to this incredible, tragic story. Her mind was racing. She looked at the woman, still not understanding the connection. She asked her why she was telling her all of this and what it had to do with her. The woman just looked at Mary, and then she began to laugh. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. She had tears streaming down face as she laughed, and she looked at Mary with this look of absolute wonder. She looked at Mary and asked her if she still didn't understand. She said that the man who had kicked open her cabin door, the man who had saved her from the burning ship, the man who had protected her on the deserted island for a year, and the man who was now locked in that hospital ward was none other than Mary's husband. Mary gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She felt the room spin. This was impossible. Her husband had died 2 years ago. They had told her he was dead. But the woman shook her head vigorously. She said he had not died. His ship had caught fire, yes, but he had survived. The reports of his death were wrong. He was alive. And then Mary heard the sound of footsteps coming down the hallway outside her room. The door to the guest room slowly opened. And standing in the doorway was her husband. He was thin, and he looked older, and he had a quiet, vacant look in his eyes from his time in the asylum, but it was him. It was really him. When he saw Mary sitting in the bed, a spark of recognition seemed to flash in his eyes. He walked into the room, and Mary threw off her blankets and ran into his arms, crying tears of absolute joy. It turned out that after Mary had rescued the woman from the shed, and the woman had recovered at the aunt's house, she had been able to tell the aunt the name of the man who saved her. The aunt immediately recognized the name of her nephew, Mary's husband. They had immediately contacted the authorities, gone to the hospital ward, and brought him home. And it had all happened because of a dream. If Mary had not had that terrifying, vivid nightmare about the shed, she would have never gone for that late-night walk. She would have never climbed that hill, she would have never found the shed, and she would have never rescued the woman. The woman would have died in that shed, and no one would have ever known that Mary's husband was actually alive, locked away in an asylum. The story of Mary and her husband became a global sensation. It was printed in newspapers across the world, and people spent years trying to find a logical explanation for how it was possible. How did Mary dream of a place she had never seen and a dying woman who held the key to her husband's survival? Some claimed it was a pure coincidence. Others believed it was a genuine premonition, a supernatural connection between two soulmates. But to Mary and her husband, the explanation did not matter. They were back together, and they spent the rest of their lives together, slowly healing from the trauma of the past 2 years. Behind every story we tell are real people. That's why we started the MrBallen Foundation, to support victims and families impacted by violent crime. To date, with your help, we've been able to donate over $1.5 million to people in need. If you are interested in joining and helping us help more people, please consider visiting our website. Some stories end with answers, but this one only leaves questions. Was it fate? A coincidence? Or something we simply can't explain? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. Think about the last time something happened to you that felt too precise to be an accident. Maybe it was small. You thought of someone you hadn't spoken to in years, and they called that afternoon. Maybe it was slightly stranger than that. Or maybe, if you're honest, there was one moment in your life that you still can't fully explain. One moment where the timing was so exact, the collision of two separate paths so perfectly arranged that the idea of pure randomness starts to feel almost naive. The 5 stories you're about to hear are not small coincidences. One of them is about a father and a daughter, both looking for each other on the same street on the same afternoon. captured together in a single photograph neither of them knew was being taken. One is about a man who told Hollywood he was nobody and accidentally convinced the right person that he was exactly who they needed. One is about a man who has been swallowed by the ocean, by the jungle, by sharks, and eventually by a whale, and who keeps walking back out. One is about a sheriff on a plane in a snowstorm who looked out his window at exactly the right second and saved a man who did not deserve to be saved. One is about a stranger who got into the wrong truck and ended up destroying the one life that had nothing to do with any of it. 5 stories. 5 moments where you'll ask yourself, what are the odds? But here's the thing about that question. Sometimes the answer is beautiful. Sometimes the answer is that the universe quietly intervened and 2 people found each other after a decade of searching. And sometimes the answer is that the same impossible precision, the same 1 in a trillion alignment of time and place puts a monster exactly where he needs to be. The odds don't care which outcome you're hoping for. They just land where they land. Let's get into it. If you're someone who likes strange, dark, and mysterious stories told like a film, you are in exactly the right place. That is all we do here, and we upload once a week. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's go. In 2007, a 60-year-old man named Michael Dick was living a quiet life in Bow, East London, with his wife and 2 daughters. He had spent most of his working years as a carpenter, and now, semi-retired, he spent the bulk of his time around family, around friends, in the rhythm of a life that was ordinary, in the best sense of the word. But that year, something started pulling at him. 10 years earlier, Michael had gone through a difficult divorce from his first wife. The split had been messy, the kind of divorce that leaves no clean lines, no good feelings, and a lot of distance between people who once shared a life. When it was finalized, his ex-wife had stayed in the family home in Sudbury, in the county of Suffolk, about an hour and a half north of London. Their daughter from that marriage, Lisa, who had been 21 at the time, had stayed with her mother. And Michael had gone south. And the years had passed. And now 10 of them were gone. He hadn't spoken to Lisa in a decade. He didn't have her phone number. He didn't know her address. He didn't even know where his ex-wife was anymore, which meant that route was closed too. Lisa had been 21 when he last saw her. She was 31 now. He had missed a significant portion of her adult life, and sitting with that fact in 2007, Michael found that he could no longer just let it sit. He talked to his wife. He talked to his 2 younger daughters. He told them he needed to find Lisa. Not wanted to, need to. And so they agreed. They would go to Sudbury and start from the only fixed point they still had, which was the address of the old family home. In August of that year, Michael and his 2 daughters loaded into the car and drove north to Sudbury. He found his old street. He parked in front of the house he had once lived in, got out alone, walked to the door, and knocked. A family he didn't recognize answered. They knew nothing about his ex-wife. They knew nothing about Lisa. They wished him luck and closed the door, and Michael walked back to the car carrying the particular weight of a plan that had already failed at the first step. The 3 of them drove around Sudbury for a while, half hoping they might simply spot Lisa on the street somewhere, knowing that was almost certainly not going to happen, and gradually arriving at a more practical idea. The local newspaper. If they could get a small feature placed in the Suffolk Free Press, a photo, a short write-up, Michael's contact information, a note explaining that he was looking for his daughter, maybe Lisa would see it, maybe she still had connections to Sudbury. Maybe someone who knew her would pass it along. They drove to the paper's offices and went inside. A reporter listened to Michael's story and agreed it was worth a small feature. He and a photographer brought Michael and his daughters outside. The photographer positioned them on the pavement in front of the building and took the picture. Michael thanked them. He and his daughters got back in the car and drove home to East London. Now we need to follow Lisa. At the same time, Michael had been sitting in East London feeling the pull toward his first daughter. Lisa, now 31, married, a mother of 3, had been feeling the exact same pull in reverse. She had been thinking about her father, about the fact that her own children had a grandfather they had never met, about whether it was too late to do something about that. She had no way to reach him. No phone number. No address. She checked social media and found nothing. She asked her mother and her friends for ideas and came up with no clear path forward. Then, one afternoon in August, Lisa was in the break room at her office when she picked up a copy of the Suffolk Free Press that someone had left on the coffee table. She flipped through the pages. And then she stopped. Because she saw herself. There was a photograph in the paper taken somewhere in Sudbury, and in the background of that photograph was a woman who was clearly her, walking along the pavement. She had been in Sudbury just a couple of days earlier, visiting her mother, talking about strategies for finding her father, and then walking back through the town center to get to her car. She glanced at the caption. The three people in the foreground of that photograph, the man and the two girls who were the actual subject of the image, were her father and her two half-sisters. She just hadn't recognized them. She was looking at her own image in the background and hadn't yet processed that the strangers in the front were the people she had been looking for. For a moment, just breathe with that. On the one afternoon that Lisa was in Sudbury specifically to discuss how to find her father, she walked into the frame of the photograph her father was having taken for the purpose of finding her. 100 feet separated them on that pavement. They were walking in the same direction, in the same town, for the same reason, without knowing the other was there. And the photographer, who had no idea any of this was happening, pressed the shutter at exactly the moment that captured all of them in the same frame. Lisa read the article. She got her father's contact information. She called him. Michael's first reaction, reportedly, was that this was a scam. Someone had read the article, seen an opportunity, and was impersonating his daughter. It took some convincing. But eventually, he believed it was real, and he drove straight to Sudbury, and he met his grandchildren for the first time. Today, Michael and Lisa are still in contact. There is no explanation for why the photographer took the shot at that precise second. There is no explanation for why Lisa happened to be in Sudbury on that particular day. There is no explanation for why, out of all the days and all the streets and all the windows and all the copies of a local newspaper sitting on coffee tables across that part of England, these two people found each other through a single accidental image in a free weekly paper. But here is the detail that stays with me longest. Lisa had gone to Sudbury specifically to talk to her mother about strategies for finding her father. That was the purpose of the trip. She was sitting in her mother's house, probably at a kitchen table, probably with a cup of something warm, working through the problem of how to locate someone who had moved on and left no trail. And then she walked back through the town center to get to her car. Mike, someone at that same moment, was standing in front of the offices of the local paper, being photographed for the article that was supposed to solve the exact same problem from his direction. They were not just in the same town. They were both actively in the middle of searching. Both of them mid-effort, mid-plan, mid-hope. And neither knew the other was there 100 feet behind them doing the same thing from the other side. When Lisa eventually called Michael and convinced him it was real, and he drove to Sudbury to meet her, there would have been a moment, some moment in that first meeting, maybe over a meal, maybe standing on a doorstep, where someone said, "We were there at the same time." We were that close. And neither of us knew. What do you do with that? There's no clean emotional response to it. There is grief in it. 10 years of distance, of not knowing, of children growing up without grandparents, and a father without his daughter. There is also something that feels almost like a joke the universe is telling, except the punchline is one you actually wanted. They were looking for each other. They were right there. A photograph caught what neither of them could see. Sometimes the universe just gets it right. And sometimes it lets you see the evidence afterward. In the final semester of his college education in Wisconsin, a 21-year-old man named Harry signed up for an acting class because he thought it would be easy. He was shy by nature and figured the class might help him come out of himself a little. He expected to sit in a room, read some lines, get his grade, and move on. Instead, two things happened. He met the woman who would become his wife. And he discovered, to his genuine surprise, that he actually loved acting. When he graduated, Harry and his new wife made the decision that most people who feel that particular love decide to make. They went to Hollywood. He auditioned for Columbia Pictures' New Talent Program, a pipeline designed to give new actors and actresses a foot in the door at a time when getting any foothold in Hollywood was nearly impossible. He was accepted. He signed a contract that paid him almost nothing. And the program immediately began sending him out for parts. Nobody wanted Harry. This is not a cruel summary, it's what happened. Month after month, the only roles that materialized were minor and non-speaking. The kind of roles that don't advance a career. The kind that fills out a crowd scene. After 2 years of this, in 1966, something changed. Harry was offered a speaking role in an actual film. Not a lead. Not a supporting part. A 60-second scene where he played a bellhop in a hotel, walked on screen, called out for a guest, found the guest, handed him a piece of paper, and left. Forgettable. But real. A real scene in a real movie with real lines that he actually got to say. Harry went to the studio and filmed it. He thought it went well. He came back to the New Talent Program offices afterward, and before he'd barely gotten through the door, one of the producers in charge of the program called him over and asked him to come upstairs. They sat down. The producer told him he had seen the scene. And then he told Harry directly and without much warmth that he was not going to make it in Hollywood. He said, when Tony Curtis carried groceries across a room in one of his first movies, everyone watching knew immediately that man was going to be a star. You could see something in him even when he was doing nothing. When you walked around as that bellhop, I didn't see it. You don't have it. You are not going to be a movie star. Harry sat there for a moment. Then he leaned forward and said, if Tony was such a good actor, shouldn't we have believed he was just a grocery delivery boy, not a movie star? The producer fired him on the spot. Harry signed a similar deal with Universal Studios. Universal's feedback was slightly different in its wording, but identical in its conclusion. Not pretty enough, not talented enough, no future here. By the mid-1970s, Harry was in his mid-30s. He still wanted to act, that hadn't changed. The love of it hadn't gone anywhere, but he was making almost nothing from it. He had a wife. He had 2 sons. He needed money. And so he made a decision that had nothing to do with any particular aptitude and everything to do with necessity. He would become a carpenter. He checked out every how-to book on carpentry he could find at the library. He practiced. He did projects around his own house. And then, when he felt either sufficiently confident or sufficiently desperate, he started calling people in his network and asking if anyone needed woodworking done. Hollywood, it turned out, had a surprising number of people who needed woodworking done, and before long, Harry had built up enough of a client base that someone gave him a name, the Carpenter to the Stars. Which was, as he would later acknowledge himself, somewhat ironic, given that he was frequently spotted on job sites holding a carpentry manual in one hand while doing the actual carpentry with the other. In 1976, Harry had been a full-time carpenter for about a year when one of his closest friends, a man named Fred Roos, who was a casting director and film producer, called him with what he described as an opportunity. Harry was not interested. He said so directly. He had accepted, more or less, that acting was behind him. He had a family to support, a business that was working, and no desire to go back into rooms where people told him he wasn't good enough. Fred told him this was different. This wasn't a standard audition. This was a situation where a very specific, very unusual director needed one more person for an audition session, and the person was not being asked to actually try out for anything. He would just sit in the room, read lines so the real candidates could deliver their performances against someone, and that was it. The director, who was known for running group auditions so he could assess chemistry and dynamic in real time, was short one male actor because someone had dropped out last minute. Fred had volunteered Harry to fill the slot. Harry pointed out, not incorrectly, that this sounded like a waste of an afternoon. Fred acknowledged that it might be. But he also pointed out that this director was becoming a significant figure in Hollywood and that the other people in that room were going to be people worth knowing, even if nothing came of the acting. Worst case, Harry walked away with a couple of potential carpentry clients and an afternoon out of the house. Fred said, "Just go. Read the lines. Don't try to act. They told me specifically he's there to facilitate the audition, not to participate in it. Just go." Harry went. He was handed the script. He was reminded more than once that he was not auditioning. Just read the lines. Monotone was fine. The other people in the room were the ones being evaluated. He was furniture. And so Harry sat there, bored, slightly irritated at having been voluntold into this situation, not performing for anyone, and just reading, being himself. Which, as it turned out, meant coming across as a grumpy, sarcastic, somewhat alpha man who didn't particularly care what anyone in the room thought of him. Because he didn't. He was only there because Fred had essentially guilt-tripped him into it, and he wasn't pretending otherwise. This, as it turned out, was exactly the quality that the director had been trying to find in one of the central characters of the film he was casting. That specific gravity, that particular kind of man who seems like he's not performing for anyone because he isn't. Nobody told Harry what was happening. He read the lines all day, decided at the end of the session that he could now throw the script in the trash and never think about this again, and was on his way out when the director walked up to him. The director's name was George Lucas. The man he had been watching all day, the man who thought he was just there to read lines and go home, was Harrison Ford. And George Lucas said, "I was wrong. You are perfect for this. I need you to play Han Solo." Harrison Ford said yes. The rest of that story is a matter of record. Star Wars was released in 1977 and became one of the most successful films in cinema history. Harrison Ford went from a carpenter who kept books in his tool belt to one of the most recognizable actors alive. A few years after all of this, after Star Wars, after the sequels, after Harrison Ford had become the kind of name people recognized everywhere, he was having lunch at a restaurant on a Hollywood studio lot when a waiter approached with a silver tray. On the tray was a single business card. The waiter set it down and walked away. Harrison picked up the card and flipped it over. On one side, written by hand, were 3 words, "I missed my bet." On the other side was the name of the producer from the new talent program, the one who had called Harry into his office in 1966, told him he had no future, and fired him on the spot. The man was apparently in the same restaurant, had spotted Harrison across the room, and had sent over that card as an acknowledgement. A concession. An olive branch, maybe, or just an honest admission from someone who had been spectacularly wrong? Harrison Ford would later say in interviews that the moment he understood what he was looking at the card, the message, the implication that this producer was somewhere in that room watching him, he scanned the room once, couldn't pick the man out because he genuinely had no idea what he looked like, decided he wasn't going to waste any more time looking, set the card down on the table, and went back to his lunch. He didn't need to find the man. The card said everything. There are people who appear to exist slightly outside the normal rules. Michael Packard is one of them. In 2001, when Michael was 38 years old, he was on a small plane over Costa Rica when it crashed. The pilot, co-pilot, and 1 passenger were killed on impact. Michael and 4 other passengers survived badly, injured, stranded in a remote section of jungle with no road access and no way to know whether the distress signal they were sending from the wreckage was reaching anyone. They waited 48 hours. Rescuers found them. A doctor at the hospital where Michael was treated told him afterward that based on his injuries, he would not have survived another night in the jungle. The odds of being in a plane crash at all, depending on your source, sit somewhere between 1 in 5 million and 1 in 20 million. To be in one, to survive it, and to be told you had 1 night left, that alone is a story most people would carry for the rest of their lives. Michael carried it and kept moving. Over the following 2 decades, Michael, who worked as a commercial diver and spent most of his professional life in the water off the coast of California and later Massachusetts, would survive not one, but 2 significant encounters with great white sharks. He would get lost at sea on open water, treading in the middle of the ocean with no land visible in any direction for hours before a boat found him. He would discover the body of a long-missing person submerged roughly 60 feet below the surface off the coast of Massachusetts. Each of these, on its own, would be a defining moment for most people. For Michael Packard, they appear to be something closer to recurring themes. But of everything that has happened to Michael Packard, nothing compares to the morning of the 11th of June 2021. He was 57 years old. He and his longtime diving partner Josiah loaded their equipment into a boat and headed out from the shore of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. The plan was lobster diving, a method that involves going down to the seafloor by hand and retrieving lobsters without any cage or trap system. Just a diver, the bottom of the ocean, and whatever happens to be down there. They reached their spot just after 6 in the morning. Josiah stayed in the boat. Michael suited up, checked his equipment, gave the signal, and went under. The first few dives produced a modest haul. Not the best day for lobsters, they agreed, but not nothing. By 8 in the morning, Michael had brought up approximately 100 pounds of lobsters. A decent morning. They decided he'd go down once more, one final dive, and then they'd call it and head back. Michael put his mouthpiece back in, gave the thumbs up, disappeared below the surface. Josiah watched the water. It was calm, quiet. And then, from somewhere below where Michael had gone down, the surface erupted a violent churning of white water shooting upward like something enormous had moved very fast just beneath it. Josiah leaned over the edge of the boat and looked down. He could see something large moving below. He could not see Michael. What had happened, as Michael would describe it later, was this. He had descended to around 45 feet, not yet at the bottom, still working his way down, when something struck him from behind with enough force that his entire body was thrown sideways and everything around him went instantly black. The impact knocked the mouthpiece out of his mouth. He was now 45 feet below the surface with no air supply, in complete darkness, and he immediately began reaching for the line connected to his mouthpiece so he could get it back. But as his hands moved through the dark space around him, they found walls. Soft walls that were also somehow firm, walls that were warm, walls that seemed to pulse and flex. He was enclosed. He was inside something. The space was relatively large enough that he wasn't immediately compressed, but it was not still. It was moving and moving fast, and the water inside it was sloshing violently against every surface. He kept reaching for the mouthpiece line. He found it. He jammed it into his mouth and inhaled. And with air back in his lungs, he had his first coherent thought. Has a shark swallowed me? He reached for teeth, feeling along the inner walls for the thing that would confirm his worst assumption. But there were no teeth. Only those shifting, pulsing walls. And then the pressure concentrated specifically on his legs intensified. That was when he understood. He had been swallowed by a humpback whale. Not a shark. A humpback. An animal that can reach 60 feet in length and 70,000 pounds in weight, and that survives entirely on small fish and krill, which meant that what was currently clamped around Michael's legs was the whale's mouth, and the whale was in the process of trying to figure out what it had accidentally collected. For approximately 45 seconds, Michael Packard was inside the closed mouth of a living humpback whale, 45 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. When the whale registered that this was not a small fish, it began shaking its head hard, back and forth to dislodge whatever it had taken in. That motion was what Josiah saw from the boat, the eruption of white water at the surface as an animal the size of a school bus thrashed its head to get rid of the thing in its mouth. After several seconds of this, Michael was expelled. He came out into open water with enough ambient light filtering down that he could see around him. The water was turbulent and disorienting. He looked down. Directly below him, the tail of the whale slid through his field of vision as the animal swam away, apparently unconcerned. Michael made it to the surface. Josiah pulled him into the boat. The first thing Michael managed to say was that he had been inside it, and that it had tried to eat him. He was taken to shore and transported to a hospital where he was evaluated. The extent of his injuries, significant bruising on his legs where the whale's mouth had been closing, no broken bones, no internal damage. No respiratory complications despite having spent the better part of a minute without consistent air supply at depth. He was discharged that afternoon. In interviews afterward, Michael Packard spoke about being swallowed by a whale with a kind of settled calm that suggested either profound equanimity or a complete recalibration of what counts as unusual. Reporters asked him how he felt, what he would do differently, whether he was going to stop diving. He said he was going back in the water as soon as he was able. Experts estimated the probability of a human being accidentally swallowed by a humpback whale, taken alive into the closed mouth of a living cetacean, and then expelled at approximately 1 in 1 trillion. Michael Packard had already survived a plane crash, 2 great white shark encounters, and being lost at sea. The ocean has tried to keep him 4 times. He keeps coming home. On the evening of the 6th of January, 1982, a man named Harold Bray, a sheriff in Jefferson County, Colorado, an area sitting just west of Denver along the edge of the Rocky Mountains, arrived at Denver International Airport running late. A snowstorm had been working over the Denver metro area for most of the day, and the drive-in had been slow and treacherous. Harold had made it, but barely. He checked in, cleared security, and reached his gate just as boarding had begun. He filed into the queue, found his seat at the front right side of the plane, buckled in, picked up the in-flight magazine from the seat pocket in front of him, and waited. 15 minutes later, the plane began its roll down the runway and lifted into the night. Harold looked out the window. Denver at night from the air is a grid of amber and white light, spreading east across the plains and pressing west against the dark wall of the Front Range. Harold knew this view well. He spent enough time in Jefferson County to know the geography below him without needing a map. And so as the plane climbed and banked west, he tracked the landscape. The city, the suburbs, the black mass of open land before the mountains began. And then something in the dark caught his eye. Cutting through the Rockies directly west of Jefferson County was a stretch of road called the Guanella Pass, 22 miles of switchbacks climbing over an 11,000-foot mountain crossing. In summer, it was a scenic drive. In winter, it was closed. Not advisable, not discouraged, closed. The road was not maintained once the snow came, and the combination of elevation, grade, and exposure made it impassable for any vehicle that didn't belong there. From the window of the ascending plane, Harold could see headlights on the Guanella Pass. In a snowstorm, at night, on a road that was supposed to have no one on it. He leaned toward the window and looked harder. The headlights weren't moving. The vehicle was stationary. And then he saw it, a light extending out from one of the windows, flashing upward into the sky. On, off, on, off. Deliberate. Rhythmic. The unmistakable signal of someone who needed help and was trying to be seen. Harold understood, in a way that required no deliberation, what he was looking at. He also understood that the probability of another plane flying over that particular section of mountains at that hour and having someone on board who recognized what they were seeing was essentially 0. If he sat back down, put the magazine in front of his face, and let the plane continue on its way, that person on the Guanella Pass would not be found until it was too late. It was negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit on that mountain that night. Harold got up, climbed over the person in the seat next to him, found a flight attendant in the aisle, and explained quickly and clearly what he had seen and what he believed it meant. The attendant took him seriously. They went to the cockpit. The pilots got on the radio. 15 minutes later, the fire department had been dispatched to the Guanella Pass. The fire He found a small pickup truck buried nose first in a snowbank, engine running, headlights still on. The man inside was named Alan Phillips, 30 years old, a mechanic from the Denver area. He was wearing a light jacket and jeans. He had a small blanket pulled around him. He had been there long enough that the cold had become something beyond discomfort, moving into the early territory of hypothermia. When Dave reached his window, Alan was crying before Dave had even introduced himself. Dave asked what had happened. Alan told him he'd had a few drinks at a bar and decided to drive home through the Guanella Pass, forgetting or not fully accounting for the fact that the road was not maintained in winter. He'd lost traction not far in and slid off the road into the snowbank. He'd tried to free the truck. Couldn't. So he'd done the only thing he could think of, grabbed his flashlight and pointed it at the sky and hoped that someone somewhere might see it and understand. Dave asked about the deep bruise on Alan's cheek. Alan, in a moment of sheepish honesty, explained that after getting stuck, he had needed to step outside to relieve himself. He walked a few feet from the truck. When he turned to walk back, the blowing snow was so dense that he couldn't see the truck. He panicked and ran directly into the door of his own vehicle, face first. Dave told him he was one lucky man. He was not wrong, just not in the way either of them understood. The story ran in local papers over the following days. Some national outlets picked it up. The miracle at Guanella Pass. A sheriff on a plane, a flashlight in a snowstorm, an improbable rescue at 11,000 feet. It had everything a feel-good story needed. Harold Bray, the unlikely hero who happened to look out the right window. Alan Phillips, the shaken survivor who had made a stupid decision and nearly paid for it with his life. Dave Montoya and the fire department, who had driven a four-wheel drive into a blizzard in the middle of the night because someone passed a message down from a plane. The whole thing read like something that was meant to happen, like the story was pointing somewhere good. That headline did not age well. 38 years later, in 2020, DNA evidence connected Alan Phillips to two unsolved murders that had occurred on the same night he got stuck on the Guanella Pass. Earlier that evening, several hours before his truck slid off the road, Alan had picked up a 22-year-old woman named Annette Schnee, who was hitchhiking in an area near Breen Ridge, Colorado, roughly 50 miles from the pass. She got into the truck. Based on what investigators believe happened next, Alan produced a weapon, restrained her with zip-tie handcuffs, drove to a remote location, walked her into the woods, and shot her in the back. Her body was found face down in a stream. A couple of hours later, Alan picked up a second hitchhiker, a 29-year-old woman named Barbara Oberholzer. She got into the truck. He restrained her the same way. But Barbara broke free of her restraints. She struck Alan in the face, the blow that left that deep bruise on his cheek that he gave Dave Montoya such an embarrassed little smile about. She threw open the door of the moving truck and ran. Alan stopped the truck, got out, chased her down, shot her in the chest. He pushed her body off the side of a cliff into the snowbank below. And then he got back in his truck and drove toward the Guanella Pass, heading for the mountains, trying to put miles between himself and what he had done. He didn't know the road was closed. Or he didn't care. Either way, he didn't make it far before the truck went sideways on the ice and buried itself in the snowbank. And so he sat there in the dark, in the cold, a man who had just killed two women and was now going to die of exposure on a mountain in a snowstorm, and he did the one thing he could think of. He pointed a flashlight at the sky. And Harold Bray, a sheriff in Jefferson County, happened to look out his window at the right moment, from the right angle, at the right altitude, and saw it. In February of 2021, Alan Phillips, 70 years old at the time, still living in the Denver area, was arrested for both murders. Annette Schnee and Barbara Oberholzer had been dead hours of 38 years before anyone was charged with killing them. The rescue and the crime exist on the same night. The same flashlight. The same snowbank. The same man. One moment was described as a miracle. The other was not. The odds of Harold Bray being on that plane at that altitude, looking out that window at that exact second, the odds are nearly incalculable. Just like the odds of being swallowed by a whale. Just like the odds of finding your daughter in the background of a photograph you didn't know she was in, the difference is what the odds were in service of. Just after midnight on the 22nd of June 1991, a man named Charles Holden was on his way home from work in Harrington, Delaware, when he stopped at a fast food restaurant near his house. He ate. He got back into his truck. He started the engine. He was about to pull out of the lot when he saw a man jogging toward him from across the parking lot, waving him down. Charles stopped. He rolled down his window. The man said his sister was having a baby. He needed a ride to the hospital about 20 minutes away. He was asking for help. Charles looked at him. It was past midnight. He didn't know this man. And something about the interaction felt off in a way that Charles couldn't articulate but also couldn't dismiss. The feeling you get sometimes when your body registers something before your mind catches up. He said no. Too late, too far out of his way, he needed to get home. The man's face fell. He turned and walked away. Charles watched him go. And then he felt bad. There's a particular discomfort in watching someone walk away who has just asked you for something, even if you have good reasons for saying no. Charles sat there for a moment with that discomfort. Then he called out to the man and told him to come back. He'd take him part of the way. The man got in. They drove in the direction of the hospital. After about 3 miles, Charles pulled over on the side of the road and told the man this was as far as he was going. He lived only a block away, and he wasn't going to drive further from home at this hour of the night. The man in the passenger seat went quiet. Then he went angry. His hand went into his pocket. He started screaming, "Give him the keys, give him the wallet, hand everything over right now or he was going to kill him." Charles didn't deliberate. He turned off the truck, ripped the keys from the ignition, shoved open his door, and ran. Off in the distance, he could see a convenience store, lights still on. He ran for it. But when he turned and looked behind him, the man had gotten out and was running too fast, gaining a screwdriver raised in his hand. Charles ran the math. He wasn't going to make the store. He stopped, turned around, raised his hands. He told the man, "Okay, get back in the truck. I'll drive you wherever you want to go. You can have my keys, my wallet, everything. Just let's get back to the truck." The man smiled. He prodded Charles forward with the screwdriver. They walked back to the vehicle, together with Charles in front, the man directly behind him, screwdriver periodically touching his back. Charles got to the driver's side door. The man told him to get in and wait. Charles got in, started the engine, and drove. He floored it. He looked in the mirror as he accelerated away and watched the man standing in the road behind him, screaming, screwdriver raised above his head, and then receding until he was too small to make out, and then gone. Charles drove for a while. He breathed. He thought about calling the police, but talked himself out of it. This had been his decision, letting a stranger into his truck at midnight, and he felt implicated in his own near robbery in a way that made him not want to make that call. What he was concerned about was geography. He had ditched this man not far from his house. If the man had noticed the neighborhood, had any sense of where Charles lived, he could be there waiting. So, rather than going straight home, Charles drove around outside of town for about an hour, letting time pass, letting the situation settle. At the end of that hour, he came back into Harrington and turned onto his street. The man was right there, walking along the road in front of his house as if he had been waiting, as if he knew exactly where Charles lived. Charles hit the brakes without thinking, threw the truck into reverse, and got out of there. He called 911 from a payphone. An officer came to him and escorted him back to his property. The man was gone by the time they arrived. There was no sign of a break-in. No sign of anyone having been near the house. Charles felt the relief spread through him as he stood in his own yard, breathing cold air, grateful that what had been a terrifying night was over. He thanked the officer and then, almost as an afterthought, asked him a favor. His mother lived directly behind him, on the other side of a row of bushes at the back of his property. Dorothy, 70 years old, living alone. Charles asked if the officer wouldn't mind doing a quick check on her just to confirm everything was okay on her side of the fence. The officer said, of course. He went across the backyard, through the bushes, into Dorothy's yard. The back window beside the door was shattered. The door itself was slightly open. The officer drew his weapon and went inside. Dorothy was upstairs. She had been stabbed to death. The man's name was Gilbert Cannon. After Charles drove away from him the second time, Gilbert had needed somewhere to sleep. He walked through the neighborhood and found a house that looked accessible. He broke in through the back door. Dorothy came down the stairs to confront the intruder. Gilbert was afraid she could identify him. He attacked her with the screwdriver he had been carrying all night. He had no idea that the house he had broken into belonged to the mother of the man he had tried to rob an hour earlier. The entire chain of events, the fast food restaurant, the late-night ride, the robbery attempt, the foot chase, the escape, the hour of driving around outside of town, the return to the neighborhood, the police escort home, and the discovery of Dorothy's body a matter of feet from where Charles was standing was, as Gilbert Cannon would later tell police, completely random. He didn't know Charles. He had picked the truck in the parking lot on impulse. After the robbery failed, he had picked the house on impulse. None of it was designed. There was no plan that threaded these two lives together. It just happened. Gilbert Cannon pleaded guilty to murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Charles Holden gave a stranger a partial ride home because he felt bad about saying no. And his mother paid for it. There is no framework that contains that. No way to resolve it into something meaningful or instructive or fair. Some things are not coincidences in the beautiful sense, they are collisions, accidents of proximity, two people arriving at the same terrible place through paths that had nothing to do with each other, except that they did. Except that Charles made a choice at a fast food counter at midnight. Except that Gilbert picked that truck and not a different one. If Charles had said no and meant it, if he hadn't felt that pull of guilt when the man turned and walked away, Gilbert never gets in that truck, never ends up in that neighborhood, never finds that house. Dorothy is alive the next morning. The distance between the ending this story had and the ending it might have had is one moment of second guessing. One small act of decency toward a stranger in a parking lot. 5 stories. A father and a daughter walking 100 feet apart, caught in the same photograph on the same afternoon in the same town where they were both searching for each other. A man who went to an audition as furniture and came home as Han Solo. A man who has been inside a plane crash, great white shark encounters, open ocean and a whale's mouth, and who keeps going back in the water because that's who he is. A sheriff who looked out a window at the right second and saved the wrong man. And a good Samaritan who gave someone a lift and lost his mother before the night was over. What connects them is not luck. Not exactly. What connects them is something harder to name, the fact that ordinary moments carry consequences that are wildly disproportionate to how they feel at the time. Michael Dick didn't know he was standing 100 feet from his daughter. Harrison Ford didn't know he was auditioning. Harold Bray didn't know what Alan Phillips had done 2 hours earlier. Charles Holden didn't know that the guilt he felt when a stranger turned and walked away would matter more than anything else that happened that night. They were just people in ordinary moments, making ordinary choices. And the universe arranged around those moments something enormous in one direction or another. The photograph finds you. The director notices. The ocean eventually lets you go. The flashlight gets seen. The stranger gets in. Most of the time, we will never know which of our ordinary moments carried the most weight. We don't get to see the photograph until it's already been taken. We don't find out about the open audition until we're already in the room. We can't know, standing in a fast food parking lot at midnight, watching someone walk away, whether the thing we're about to decide will change everything. We just make the call. And then we find out what it meant. Thank you for watching. If you want more stories like these, there are hundreds of them here on this channel. And if you want one recommendation from me, one video that's worth your time right now, it's this one right here. Until next time.